For 35 years, my parents paraded my younger sister around as the family genius while introducing me as their unfortunate disappointment. On the afternoon of her Harvard graduation, they threw a lavish party at their $17 million Buckhead estate to announce she was inheriting everything, including the house and a brand new Lamborghini. They laughed in my face, expecting me to cry. I simply smiled, took a sip of my champagne, and waited for the man in the tailored suit to walk through the gates and hand me the red envelope that would legally render them homeless before dessert was served. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Please hit subscribe and like this video to find out how that single envelope destroyed their empire and revealed who I really am. I am Nia, 35 years old, and the invisible ghost of my own family. I pulled my rented silver Toyota Camry up to the towering wrought iron gates of my parents' estate in the most exclusive neighborhood of Buckhead, Atlanta. The sprawling manicured lawns stretched out like a green velvet carpet, leading up to the imposing limestone facade of the $17 million mansion. The house gleamed under the relentless afternoon sun, an absolute monument to my parents' obsession with wealth and status. Today was supposed to be a monumental celebration. My 28-year-old sister Jasmine was officially a law school graduate. It was a crowning achievement that my parents Richard and Brenda had literally bought and paid for with massive strategic donations. I rolled down my window as a young valet in a crisp white uniform approached my car. He looked at my practical sedan, and his smile faltered. He glanced nervously down at his clipboard and then back at me, shifting his weight from foot to foot as if he were standing on hot coals. He actively avoided making eye contact. "I am so sorry, Mom," he stammered, his voice barely louder than the hum of my engine. "I cannot park this vehicle on the main drive." Mrs. Brenda left strict instructions this morning. She said that any economy cars and rentals need to be parked 3 blocks down at the community center. She specifically noted that vehicles like this would ruin the aesthetic of the luxury car display for the event photography. I looked past the young man toward the sweeping circular driveway. It was already lined shoulder to shoulder with gleaming Bentleys, sleek Porsches, and towering Mercedes SUVs. A familiar tightening gripped my chest. It was the exact same heavy, suffocating sensation I had felt since childhood, whenever my mother found a fresh, creative way to remind me of my inferior place in her world. Growing up as an African-American family in the most affluent circles of Atlanta society meant that outward appearance was not just important, it was everything. My parents had built a superficial kingdom entirely on the illusion of absolute perfection. Jasmine, with her designer clothes, her flawless smile, and her carefully curated social circle, was their perfect princess. I, on the other hand, was the dark mark on their pristine canvas. I did not go to an Ivy League school. I did not marry a wealthy socialite. I was quiet, observant, and fiercely independent. To them, I was just a mid-level office worker scraping by in a tiny New York apartment. They loved to tell their country club friends that I was still just finding my way. I knew that was simply their polite Southern code for calling me a total failure. Instead of arguing with the anxious valet or demanding to speak to my mother, I simply offered him a polite, reassuring smile. "I understand," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm. "It is really not your fault at all. Have a good afternoon working the event." I put the car in reverse and slowly backed out of the grand entrance, making sure not to block the arrival of an incoming Maserati. I drove the 3 long blocks down the sweltering, tree-lined Atlanta street and parked the Camry in the dusty, cracked asphalt lot of the local community center. I grabbed my purse, locked the doors, and began the long walk back to the estate in my high heels. Every single step on that blistering hot pavement served as a vivid reminder of the 1,000 little indignities I had endured over 3 decades of being their daughter. I remembered being 16 years old and asking my mother to help pay for an advanced placement prep course. She flatly refused, telling me it was a poor investment to waste money on someone with such an average intellect. Yet that very same week, she bought Jasmine a brand new convertible simply because she managed to get a passing grade on a middle school history test. I remembered moving out at 18 to go to a state college. They turned my bedroom into an expansive walk-in closet for Jasmine before my cardboard boxes were even loaded into my friend's car. They always treated me like an unwanted guest who had finally overstayed her welcome. My parents believed I was weak simply because I never yelled back at their insults. They genuinely believed I was poor because I drove a rental car and wore understated, unbranded clothing. What Richard and Brenda did not know as I walked up the long, steep hill toward their fortress of arrogance was that the rental car was a highly deliberate choice to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. They did not know that the understated navy dress I was currently sweating in was a custom-tailored piece worth more than my father's country club membership. Most importantly, they had absolutely no idea that for the past 10 years, I had been quietly and ruthlessly building a massive private equity firm in Manhattan. I was not a struggling office clerk drowning in debt. I was the sole founder and CEO of a multi-billion-dollar investment fund. I was the invisible hand, moving the financial markets they so desperately tried to impress. I handled complex acquisitions worth hundreds of millions of dollars before I even finished my morning coffee. I reached the edge of the property, wiping a small bead of sweat from my forehead. I could hear the clinking of crystal champagne flutes and the low, continuous hum of pretentious laughter drifting over the tall hedges from the expansive pool deck. I took a deep, steadying breath, centering my mind and locking away my emotions. Today was the day their grand illusion would finally shatter into a million pieces. I just needed to play my designated part as the pathetic, jealous older sister for a few more hours. I walked through the side gate, ready to face the family that had thrown me away. I navigated the narrow cobblestone path leading to the catering entrance. The air back here was thick with the smell of roasting meats, garlic, and expensive truffle oil. A dozen staff members in black aprons rushed past me carrying massive silver trays of caviar and delicate pastries. It was the hidden engine room of my parents' carefully constructed illusion. The caterers shouted instructions over the roar of industrial fans trying to combat the heavy Georgia heat. I stepped carefully over a thick coil of electrical wire just as the heavy oak service door swung open. There stood my mother, Brenda. She was draped in a pale pink designer suit that probably cost more than the average American makes in 6 months. Her hair was sprayed into an immovable helmet of perfection, not a single strand daring to fall out of place. She was not back here to check on the food or ensure the staff was working efficiently. She was waiting for me. She knew exactly which entrance I would be forced to use, because she had orchestrated the entire scenario. "Naya, you are late," she snapped. Her eyes darted around frantically, making sure none of the busy catering staff were listening before she reached out, grabbed my wrist and pulled me sharply into a dimly lit storage pantry, just off the main kitchen. "I drove the car to the community center, just like you asked," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and unbothered. I had to walk the rest of the way in the heat. She ignored my explanation completely, as if my physical comfort was completely irrelevant to the grand production of her afternoon. Instead, her eyes raked up and down my body, performing a merciless visual autopsy. She let out a heavy dramatic sigh of profound disappointment, a sound I had heard 1,000 times throughout my childhood. "I specifically told you to wear something elegant, Nia." "What exactly is this?" she asked forcefully, pinching the sleeve of my navy dress. "It looks like something you picked up off a clearance rack at a discount department store." "Jasmine is out there wearing vintage couture. You look like you are about to go sit in a cubicle at a mid-level corporate board meeting." I held my tongue and maintained my calm exterior. I did not tell her that the dress she was currently insulting was entirely hand-stitched by a highly exclusive private designer in Milan. I did not mention that the fabric she was squeezing with such disdain was a rare silk blend that required a 6-month waiting list just to order. To my mother, anything that lacked a massive flashy designer logo was considered cheap. Then her sharp gaze locked onto my chest. Her perfectly manicured fingers reached out and aggressively tapped the stone resting against my collarbone. And this, she hissed, her voice dripping with absolute disgust. This right here is exactly why I did not want you mingling near the front of the house when the guests arrived. What on earth possessed you to wear a cheap cubic zirconia fake to a party of this caliber? Do you have any idea who is out there right now drinking our champagne? She did not wait for me to answer. We have federal judges, corporate executives, and Jasmine's new wealthy in-laws roaming our gardens. These are people who know what real luxury looks like, Nia. They can spot a desperate fraud from a mile away. I looked down at the necklace. It was a single elegant stone, set in a simple platinum band. I simply like how it catches the light, I said quietly, giving her exactly the meek, defeated response she expected from her disappointing older daughter. Well, you look completely ridiculous, Brenda snapped, taking a step closer. Her expensive perfume, a suffocating cloud of heavy floral notes, made my eyes water in the cramped, airless pantry. You are 35 years old, Nia. You do not need to play dress-up with cheap mall jewelry to pretend you are successful. It is embarrassing to you, and it is highly embarrassing to this family. Take it off right now. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because my feelings were hurt, but because I was calculating my next move. Take it off! Brenda demanded again, her voice rising to a sharp, demanding pitch that echoed slightly off the metal shelving. You are not going out there looking like a desperate wannabe trying to upstage your sister on the biggest day of her life. Put it in your purse, or I will have the security guards escort you right back out that service gate. I will not let your poor life choices and your tacky accessories humiliate Jasmine today. I reached behind my neck and smoothly unclasped the delicate platinum chain. The metal felt cool and familiar against my skin. I dropped the necklace into the palm of my hand. The stone caught the dim, flickering fluorescent light of the pantry and threw back a brilliant, dazzling array of sharp white fire. My mother rolled her eyes, clearly thinking it was just cheap glass polished to a high shine by a desperate woman. As I slipped the necklace into the inner silk pocket of my leather clutch, a cold wave of pure amusement washed over my mind. My mother, a woman who had spent her entire adult life worshipping wealth and chasing social status, could not even recognize genuine luxury when it was right in front of her face. That stone was not a cubic zirconia from a discount mall kiosk. It was a flawless 3-carat custom-cut diamond that I had personally flown to Antwerp to purchase. I bought it for myself to celebrate the exact day my private equity firm closed our very first billion-dollar commercial real estate acquisition. It was a silent, heavily guarded reminder of my own massive financial power. A power I had built entirely without their help, without a single dollar of their money, and completely without their approval. The necklace currently sitting casually in my purse was worth significantly more than the entire extravagant catering budget for the party my mother was currently hosting. Better, Brenda said, smoothing the lapels of her suit, as if she had just successfully disciplined a disobedient child. Now go out there and try to blend into the background. Do not talk about your little clerical job with anyone. If any of the guests ask what you are doing these days, just tell them you are in transition. And stay away from the main bar. Let the important people get their drinks first. She turned on her heel and marched back out the door, heading toward the blinding sunlight of the pool deck, leaving me standing alone among the boxes of extra napkins and spare silverware. I snapped my clutch shut. The heavy iron grip of her emotional manipulation, the exact same suffocating grip that used to make me cry myself to sleep when I was a teenager, felt utterly powerless to me now. She thought she had just stripped me of my dignity and put me in my rightful place. She had absolutely no idea she had just handed me another solid piece of armor. Every insult she threw at me only cemented my resolve for what was about to happen later this afternoon. I smoothed the front of my expensive navy dress, took one last deep breath of the chaotic kitchen air, and walked out of the shadows. I stepped into the glaring bright light of the extravagant party, fully prepared to play the role of the invisible sister for just a little while longer. I pushed through the heavy double doors of the kitchen and stepped out onto the expansive travertine pool deck. The sheer scale of the event was staggering. A towering ice sculpture shaped like the scales of justice stood melting slowly under the brutal Georgia sun, a heavy-handed tribute to Jasmine's new law degree. A live jazz quartet played softly in the corner, while waiters in white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of oysters and vintage champagne. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the hollow ringing of fake laughter. 200 of Atlanta's most elite socialites, politicians, and business moguls were gathered around the shimmering blue water, wearing their finest designer clothing and trading empty compliments. I kept to the edge of the crowd, trying to navigate toward a quiet corner near the cabanas. I had absolutely no desire to make small talk with my parents' superficial friends who would only ask condescending questions about my fictional data entry job. But before I could reach the shade of the large umbrellas, a heavy hand slammed aggressively into my shoulder. A freezing splash of liquid hit my chest and soaked rapidly into the front of my silk navy dress. "Oops, my bad, sister-in-law," a loud, booming voice echoed over the soft jazz music. I did not even need to look up to know who it was. Jamal. He was Jasmine's husband of 2 years and my father's hand-picked golden son-in-law. Jamal was a man who possessed absolutely zero actual talent but had an endless supply of unearned confidence. My father had given him a do-nothing executive director title at the family company, simply because Jamal knew how to play golf and kiss the right rings at the country club. He was standing in front of me wearing a flashy velvet blazer that was completely inappropriate for the afternoon heat, a massive diamond-encrusted watch hanging loosely off his wrist. He was holding an empty crystal champagne flute and grinning a predatory smile that told me the collision was entirely intentional. "Watch where you are going, Nia," Jamal said loudly, drawing the attention of several wealthy guests standing nearby. His voice dripped with that familiar, arrogant condescension he always reserved specifically for me. "You cannot just go barging through high society parties like you are pushing a shopping cart at a discount grocery store." A few of the guests chuckled awkwardly, turning their heads to watch the interaction. Jamal thrived on an audience. He loved nothing more than stepping on me to elevate his own status in front of my parents' friends. I looked down at the dark, wet stain spreading across my bodice. The icy champagne clung to my skin, but I kept my face perfectly still. I did not gasp. I did not flinch. I slowly pulled a crisp white napkin from a passing waiter's tray and began to dab at the delicate fabric. "It is quite all right, Jamal," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "Accidents happen." He laughed, a sharp barking sound that grated on my nerves. "It is a shame about that dress," though he continued stepping closer so he could look down his nose at me. "Then again, it does not look like it cost more than a standard utility bill. Tell you what, Nia, since I know things are probably tight for a mid-level office clerk like yourself, let me help you out." With a theatrical flourish, Jamal reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a sleek leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a heavy metal black credit card, making sure the matte finish caught the sunlight so everyone around us could see it. He tapped the exclusive card against his chin, pretending to think. "Actually," he said, snapping his fingers, "I do not even need to swipe the black card for this. I carry petty cash for the valet." He reached into another pocket, pulled out a crumpled $100 bill, and held it out toward me between his index and middle finger. "Here you go, Naya. Take this and go buy yourself something nice at a department store clearance rack. Maybe something that does not make you look like a tragic charity case at my wife's graduation party." The sheer audacity of his performance was almost impressive. The guests nearby murmured to each other, clearly pitying the poor, unfortunate sister who had to rely on her wealthy brother-in-law for clothing money. Jamal stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for me to either burst into tears or angrily storm off the pool deck. He expected a reaction. He fed on the power of making me feel small. Instead, I simply smiled. It was not a tight, forced smile, but a genuine, relaxed curve of my lips. I politely pushed his hand away, refusing the crumpled bill. "Keep it, Jamal," I said softly, my eyes locking directly onto his. You might need it for gas on the way home. He scoffed, putting the money back in his pocket and shaking his head. Suit yourself, Nia. Stay poor. He turned around and strutted back toward his group of friends, laughing loudly and patting the back of a local real estate developer. As I stood there, wiping the last of the expensive champagne from my custom silk dress, a deep, powerful sense of satisfaction bloomed in my chest. Jamal thought his heavy black credit card and his diamond watch made him a king. He thought he was untouchable. What the audience of wealthy onlookers did not know, what my arrogant brother-in-law had absolutely no way of comprehending, was the actual financial reality behind his flashy velvet blazer. Jamal was not rich. Jamal was drowning. Through my private equity firm, I had full access to the comprehensive financial profiles of everyone in my family. I knew every single secret they tried to hide behind their massive gates and luxury cars. That black metal credit card Jamal just flashed so proudly was currently overdrawn by $85,000. His flashy diamond watch was financed on a 36-month payment plan that was 3 months in arrears. Even the luxury penthouse condo he and Jasmine lived in downtown was heavily mortgaged to the absolute limit. But the most beautiful, the most delicious piece of information was the identity of the firm holding all of Jamal's suffocating debt. 2 years ago, when Jamal was desperately trying to keep up appearances and fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle, he had taken out a massive high-interest personal loan from a boutique shadow lending firm in Manhattan. He used his meaningless shares in my father's company as collateral, thinking the transaction was completely untraceable. He had no idea that the shadow firm was a subsidiary completely owned and operated by my primary investment portfolio. Jamal did not just owe money. Jamal owed me money. I owned the debt on his watch. I owned the mortgage on his penthouse. I owned the very credit card he just tried to humiliate me with. Every time he swiped that piece of black metal to buy expensive champagne or tailor-made suits, he was literally paying interest directly into my personal bank accounts. He was standing on a trapdoor, and my hand was resting comfortably on the lever. I tossed the damp napkin onto a passing tray and smoothed my ruined dress. Let him have his moment of glory, I thought, watching him boast to the crowd. Let him enjoy the taste of that vintage champagne. Because in just a few short hours, when my legal team arrived with the foreclosure documents, Jamal was going to learn exactly what it felt like to have absolutely nothing. And I was going to make sure he remembered this exact moment when he offered the woman who owned his entire life a crumpled $100 bill. I turned away from the pool deck and walked toward the glass doors of the main house. The outdoor party was just getting started, but the real entertainment was about to begin inside my father's private study. The cool air conditioning hit my damp skin as I stepped through the sliding glass doors into the main foyer of the house. The heavy thumping of the jazz bass from the pool deck faded into the background, replaced by the steady ticking of a massive antique grandfather clock in the hallway. I barely had a moment to adjust my eyes to the indoor lighting before a large, heavy hand clamped down hard on my upper arm. I turned to see my father Richard towering over me. At 60 years old, he still carried himself like a heavyweight boxer who had transitioned into corporate boardrooms. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal suit that strained slightly against his broad shoulders, and his jaw was set tight in a permanent scowl of disapproval. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my flight from New York was. He did not even acknowledge the large wet champagne stain on the front of my custom silk dress. In here now, he commanded his voice a low, dangerous gravel. His grip on my arm was tight enough to bruise as he practically dragged me down the long corridor lined with expensive imported oil paintings. He steered me away from the lingering catering staff and shoved me roughly into his private study, locking the heavy oak door behind us with a loud, definitive click. My father's study was a room designed entirely to intimidate anyone who entered it. The walls were paneled in dark cherry wood and lined with towering bookshelves holding leather-bound volumes he had never actually read. The air smelled of expensive Scotch polished leather and the suffocating weight of his enormous ego. I stood perfectly still in the center of the Persian rug while he marched around to the other side of his massive mahogany desk. He did not offer me a seat. Instead, he picked up a thick stack of legal papers bound by a blue cover and slapped them down hard onto the polished wood surface. He placed a heavy gold fountain pen right on top of the stack. Then he looked up at me with eyes that held absolutely zero paternal affection. "Sign it," he ordered. I stepped forward slowly, maintaining my calm demeanor. I leaned over the desk and read the bold black font across the top page. It was a formal relinquishment of shares. Specifically, it was a legally binding document designed to surrender my 10% equity stake in the family communications company. That 10% was not a gift from my parents. It was left to me by my late grandmother, the only person in this family who ever looked at me and saw someone with actual potential. "What is this, Richard?" I asked deliberately, dropping the formality of calling him Dad. I knew exactly what it was, but I wanted to hear him say the words out loud. He unbuttoned his suit jacket and leaned forward, resting his knuckles on the desk. "It is a simple transfer of assets," he said, waving his hand dismissively, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. "Jasmine just graduated from Harvard Law. She cannot go work in some public defender's office or sit in a cubicle doing grunt work for a mid-tier firm. She needs her own private practice. A luxury firm right here in Buckhead, with her name on the door. It will solidify our family legacy and position her perfectly in the high society circles." "And what does her boutique law firm have to do with my grandmother's shares?" I asked, keeping my face completely blank. He sighed heavily, clearly annoyed that he had to explain business to his supposedly slow-witted daughter. "Opening a high-end firm requires massive initial capital, Nia. I need to take out a substantial commercial loan to secure the prime real estate downtown and fund her operating costs for the first 2 years. The bank requires maximum collateral. I am putting up the company, but I cannot secure the premium interest rate unless I pledge 100% of the voting shares. Your little 10% is holding up a multi-million-dollar deal. I need it back." He called it my little 10%. He spoke about my only inheritance, as if it were a clerical error he was graciously correcting. He wanted me to hand over the only tangible piece of legacy my grandmother had given me so he could buy Jasmine a shiny new office to play lawyer in. It was the ultimate sacrifice. He was demanding I set myself on fire just to keep his golden child warm. When my grandmother passed away 5 years ago, she bypassed my father completely with that 10%. She sat me down in her hospital room and told me she knew my parents were blindingly reckless with money. She gave me that equity as a safety net because she knew one day Richard would try to sink the ship to fund his extravagant lifestyle. She made it an ironclad trust transfer. He had spent the last 5 years trying to find legal loopholes to snatch it back, and now he was resorting to direct bullying. "You do not even know what to do with equity, Nia," he continued, his tone shifting from aggressive to fiercely patronizing. "You work at a desk. You rent a cheap car. You have absolutely no concept of how high-level corporate finance works. Those shares are just sitting there gathering dust in your name. Jasmine actually needs them. She has a real future. She has the Harvard degree. She is the one who is going to take the family name to the next level. You are just holding us back." I looked down at the gold pen resting on the document. My father truly believed I was a financial illiterate. He thought I was just a stubborn obstacle standing in the way of Jasmine's unearned success. He had absolutely no idea that I spent my days structuring acquisitions that dwarfed his entire company. He did not realize that the very bank he was begging for a commercial loan was actually majority owned by my private equity syndicate. I could have bought his entire company 10 times over with the spare liquidity in my secondary accounts. "Pick up the pen, Nia," my father snapped, breaking my train of thought. He tapped his thick finger hard against the signature line on the final page. "We have 200 of the most important people in Atlanta drinking our liquor out by the pool. I have to go out there in 20 minutes and make a speech presenting Jasmine with her new life. I am not going to let your petty jealousy ruin this family trajectory." Sign the paper right now so I can email the executed contract to the bank manager before the party ends. I reached out and let my fingertips brush against the cool metal of the fountain pen. I felt no anger. I felt no sorrow. The little girl inside me who used to beg for her father's approval had died a long time ago. All that was left standing in this mahogany room was a ruthless corporate predator looking at a wounded, bleeding animal that did not even realize it was already dead. My continued silence seemed to ignite a short fuse behind my father's eyes. He interpreted my stillness not as absolute control, but as the pathetic hesitation of a slow mind trying to process a simple command. He slammed his open palm against the mahogany desk, making the heavy crystal whiskey decanter rattle violently against its silver tray. The sudden sharp noise echoed off the wood-paneled walls of the study, but I did not flinch. "What exactly is going through that thick head of yours right now?" He demanded, his voice rising from a gravelly whisper to a sharp, commanding shout. "Do you honestly think you have a choice in this matter? Do you think this is a negotiation?" I looked at him calmly. "I am simply reading the terms of the surrender." Richard I said, my voice soft, but entirely devoid of the fear he was so desperately trying to provoke. He let out a harsh, mocking laugh that held absolutely no humor. "Surrender," he mocked, shaking his head in profound disgust. "You have to actually be in a fight to surrender, Nia. You are not in a fight. You are barely even in the game. Look at yourself." He stepped around the massive desk, closing the physical distance between us as if his sheer physical size could force my hand to move. He pointed a thick, accusatory finger directly at my chest. "You are 35 years old," he sneered, the words dripping with toxic contempt. 35. You have no husband. You have no children. You have absolutely no viable prospects. While your sister was securing a brilliant marriage to a man with deep societal ties, you were hiding away in some tiny, cramped apartment in New York, playing at being an independent woman. You are a spinster, Nia. A certified middle-aged failure who had to rent a cheap economy car just to show up at a party you could never afford to host yourself. He paused, taking a deep breath so he could deliver his next sequence of insults with maximum impact. "We all know the truth," he continued, his voice dropping into a cruel, mocking register. "We have always known it. You are the dumb one in this family. You always have been. You struggled your way through a mediocre state college while Jasmine conquered Harvard. She is a legal prodigy with the entire world at her feet. You are nothing but a clerical error in our family history. You lack the intelligence, the drive, and the fundamental pedigree to ever amount to anything of real value. Those shares belong in the hands of someone who actually knows how to build a legacy, not someone who is going to spend the rest of her pathetic life fetching coffee for middle management." Every word he spat was designed to break me. He was deliberately pressing on all the old bruises, the deeply ingrained childhood insecurities that used to make me lock myself in my bedroom and cry for hours. He was using the exact same emotional manipulation tactics that had kept my mother and my sister completely under his thumb for decades. He expected my eyes to fill with tears. He expected my shoulders to slump in defeat. He expected the broken little girl he had systematically neglected to finally pick up the gold fountain pen and sign away her only financial safety net, just to earn a fleeting crumb of his approval. But the broken little girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who routinely dismantled predatory billionaires before lunch. His insults did not pierce my armor. They simply bounced off, leaving behind nothing but a profound sense of clinical pity. When I did not immediately reach for the pen, my father's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The vein in his thick neck began to throb. He realized the emotional abuse was not working, so he immediately pivoted to the only other weapon he had left in his arsenal: absolute brute force tyranny. He leaned in so close I could smell the sharp metallic tang of his expensive scotch mingling with his anger. "Listen to me very carefully, because I will only say this once," he whispered with lethal precision. "You will pick up that pen, and you will sign those relinquishment papers right now. If you do not put your signature on that line before I walk out of this room, you are entirely finished." He raised his hand and began counting off his threats on his fingers. "First, I will have my lawyers draft the paperwork to officially and legally disown you. I will strike your name from the family trust. I will remove you from every single will, insurance policy, and emergency contact list. You will be completely erased from our family history as if you were never even born. If you die in that miserable New York apartment, I will not even pay to have your body shipped back to Georgia. Second," he continued, his voice vibrating with absolute malice, "I will have the security guards drag you out of this house by your hair and throw you onto the street. You will never be allowed to set foot on this property again. You will not attend family holidays. You will not be invited to Jasmine's future functions. You will be a total ghost to us." He slammed his hands down on the desk, leaning his weight forward. "And finally, I will personally destroy whatever pathetic little career you think you have managed to scrape together. I know every major CEO in Atlanta. I have connections on Wall Street. I have golfed with the men who run the banking industry. I will make 3 phone calls this afternoon, and I will have you permanently blacklisted. I will make sure a glowing recommendation from Richard never reaches your desk, and instead a quiet word of warning ruins every single job interview you ever go on. You will never find employment above minimum wage in this state again. I will crush you so completely that you will be begging to come back here and wash Jasmine's cars just to afford your rent." He stood back up, straightening his bespoke tie, clearly immensely satisfied with his own ruthless monologue. "Now sign the damn paper, Nia. Do not make me ruin your life on a day we are supposed to be celebrating." I stood perfectly still, letting the heavy silence of the room stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. The sheer irony of his threats was almost too much to process. He was threatening to erase me from a family that had never truly included me in the first place. He was threatening to kick me out of a $17 million house that, unbeknownst to him, I already legally owned. But the most comical threat of all was his promise to blacklist me in the business community. He honestly believed his country club handshakes and his localized Atlanta influence could somehow destroy the career of a private equity titan. He wanted to call his banking friends to ruin me without realizing that I was the phantom majority shareholder sitting on the board of the very institution he was desperately begging for a loan. He was a man standing in a puddle threatening to drown the ocean. I looked at the blue-bound contract on the desk. Then I looked at the heavy gold fountain pen. I slowly reached out my hand and picked the pen up, holding it elegantly between my fingers. My father let out a harsh breath of victory. A smug, self-satisfied smile spread across his face as he watched me uncap the pen. He thought he had won. He thought the natural order of his universe had been restored. The dumb one was finally doing exactly what she was told. I hovered the gold nib over the thick black line at the bottom of the page. I kept my eyes focused on the paper as I spoke. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air of the study like a razor blade. "Jasmine is going to need a lot of help in her future. She is going to need all the support she can get." I placed the cap back onto the fountain pen with a loud, definitive click. I did not sign the document. Instead, I set the pen down gently on the edge of the mahogany desk. I picked up my leather clutch and turned my back on him, walking toward the heavy oak door. I paused with my hand on the brass doorknob, turning my head just slightly to look over my shoulder. "Unfortunately for you," I added, my voice entirely drained of any emotion, "I am not in the business of funding bad investments. You will have to find another way to pay for her life." I turned the knob, pulled the door open, and stepped out into the brightly lit hallway, leaving him completely speechless in the dark study. I did not run. I walked with the slow, measured pace of a woman who was in absolute control of her destiny. As I walked down the long corridor toward the sliding glass doors that led back out to the pool deck, I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. I opened my encrypted messaging app and typed a single short message to Mr. Crawford, my head of legal, who was currently waiting in a black SUV exactly 2 blocks away. Bring the envelope to the pool deck. It is time. I hit send, slipped the phone back into my bag, and stepped out into the blinding afternoon sun, ready to watch my father's entire world burn to the ground. Before I placed the cap back on that gold fountain pen and gave him my final refusal, my eyes deliberately drifted from the signature line of the relinquishment contract to the secondary stack of papers resting near his left elbow. My father was incredibly sloppy. He was so arrogant and so completely confident in my absolute stupidity that he did not even bother to cover his internal ledger printouts or his master banking portfolio. I kept my voice perfectly level as I began to read the upside-down columns of numbers aloud. You are reporting a year-over-year revenue increase, Richard, but your accounts receivable tell a completely different story. You are operating on a 90-day deficit with your primary vendors. He froze. The smug, self-satisfied smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. I reached out with my free hand and casually flipped open the second folder, exposing his quarterly balance sheets. He lunged forward, trying to snatch the folder away, but I was much faster. Your gross margins have deteriorated by 22% over the last 4 quarters. I continued, my eyes scanning the spreadsheets with the surgical precision I used every single day in Manhattan. You are actively masking a massive liquidity crisis by categorizing short-term mezzanine debt as long-term liabilities. You are not taking out a commercial loan to fund a luxury law firm for Jasmine. You are trying to secure a desperate bailout to stop your own communications company from going into federal foreclosure. Richard stared at me as if I had suddenly started speaking a dead, ancient language. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His heavy chest stopped heaving. For 35 years, he had convinced himself and everyone around him that I was a simple-minded desk clerk. Hearing me effortlessly dissect his catastrophic financial reality in a matter of seconds completely short-circuited his brain. You are hemorrhaging cash, I said, dropping the folder back onto the polished mahogany desk. You have overvalued your physical assets by at least 40% to trick the commercial underwriters. If the bank runs even a basic routine stress test on this application, they will not just deny the loan. They will flag your entire portfolio for a federal audit. Your company is already dead, Richard. You are just trying to burn my 10% equity to keep the corpse warm for a few more months. The silence in the study was absolute and heavy. For one brief, glorious moment, I saw genuine panic flash in his dark eyes. A bead of sweat formed at his temple. He realized he was exposed. He realized the daughter he had spent decades treating like an intellectual inferior had just read his complex financial ruin like a simple children's picture book. But his massive ego, the fragile, superficial structure that dictated his entire existence in the Atlanta high society, simply could not allow him to be outsmarted by his biggest disappointment. His mind desperately scrambled to regain the upper hand. His face flushed a deep, dangerous shade of purple. He snatched the folder off the desk and shoved it violently into his top drawer, slamming it shut so hard the wood rattled. You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about. He spat, his voice trembling with a forced, aggressive bravado. You read a few generic business articles on the internet, and suddenly you think you are a Wall Street financial analyst. This is high-level corporate structuring, Nia. It is complex debt leveraging. You do not understand real business. You never have. You just look at big numbers and panic because you have a small, narrow mind. He pointed a thick, shaking finger toward the contract again. You do not understand how wealthy people move money. You are just making pathetic excuses because you are wildly jealous of your sister. Now stop playing pretend and sign the paper. That was the exact moment I realized he was not just a bully. He was a deeply delusional man, driving his expensive car directly off a cliff and screaming at the passengers for complaining about the view. There was no saving him, and more importantly, I had absolutely no desire to try. My grandmother had left me those shares to protect me from his financial incompetence, and I was not going to hand over my only family legacy to fund Jasmine's fake success. That is when I told him I was not in the business of funding bad investments. I set the gold pen down gently on the edge of the desk without leaving my signature. I turned my back on him and walked toward the heavy oak door. He shouted after me, repeating his loud threats about disowning me and ruining my non-existent clerical career. But his voice sounded incredibly thin and desperate now. The roaring lion of the family had been reduced to a cornered rat trapped in a maze of his own bad debt. I stepped out of the study, and the heavy door clicked shut behind me, instantly cutting off his angry tirades. I stood alone in the quiet, air-conditioned hallway. The antique grandfather clock ticked rhythmically, echoing the steady, calm beating of my own heart. The setup was completely finished. He had shown me exactly who he was, for the very last time. Now it was time for the execution. I reached into my leather clutch and retrieved my phone. I bypassed my standard contacts and opened my highly encrypted corporate messaging application. I did not need to consult with a board of directors. I did not need to ask for permission from a senior manager. I had absolute unilateral authority over my private equity firm and every single asset it controlled. I opened the private chat thread with Mr. Crawford, my senior legal counsel, and the man who had personally orchestrated the hostile backdoor takeover of my father's shadow debt over the last 8 months. I typed a single short message. Bring the envelope to the pool deck. It is time. I watched the bright screen for exactly 3 seconds before the small indicator showed that the message had been read. A moment later, 3 dots appeared, followed by a single definitive word reply. Acknowledged. Mr. Crawford was not just a lawyer. He was a ruthless legal predator who wore custom-tailored Italian suits and possessed a mind like a steel trap. He had been waiting in an idling black SUV just outside the neighborhood gates for the past hour. Sitting on the leather seat next to him was a thick red sealed envelope that contained the absolute destruction of my parents' superficial kingdom. That envelope held the official federal bankruptcy filings. It held the finalized transfer of deeds. It held the immediate foreclosure notices for everything my father claimed to own. Most importantly, it contained the legal proof that the $17 million Buckhead estate we were currently standing in was now the exclusive property of my corporate portfolio. I slipped my phone back into my purse and took a deep cleansing breath. The suffocating weight of my childhood, the years of being called the dumb one, the endless comparisons to Jasmine, all of it began to wash away. The smell of expensive catering and blooming jasmine flowers wafted in from the sliding glass doors leading to the massive outdoor patio. Suddenly, the faint sound of my father tapping his crystal champagne glass echoed from the outside speakers. He had rushed out of the study right behind me, plastering a fake smile onto his face, to address the crowd of 200 elite guests. It was time for his grand announcement. It was time for him to publicly gift his golden child a kingdom that no longer existed. I adjusted the collar of my silk dress, completely unbothered by the wet champagne stain Jamal had intentionally left there earlier. I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking softly against the expensive imported marble floor. I was walking toward the glaring sunlight of the pool deck, fully prepared to step out of the shadows for the very first time in my life. The era of the invisible ghost sister was officially over. I stepped out of the cool, air-conditioned hallway and immediately hit a solid wall of thick Georgia humidity and deafening social chatter. The patio of the Buckhead estate was massive, paved entirely in imported Italian travertine stone that practically blinded you in the afternoon sun. I navigated my way to the far edge of the pool deck, finding a quiet spot in the deep shade of a towering imported palm tree. From this vantage point, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of my parents' carefully curated kingdom. It was a breathtaking display of financial desperation masquerading as unimaginable wealth. The pool itself was filled with floating white lotus flowers and surrounded by four massive ice sculptures that were already weeping under the brutal southern heat. Waiters in crisp white uniforms moved through the crowd like synchronized swimmers, holding silver trays loaded with beluga caviar and glasses of vintage champagne. But the most fascinating part of the scenery was the guests themselves. My parents had invited 200 of the most influential people in Atlanta, and every single one of them was playing a part in this elaborate theatrical production. I watched local politicians shaking hands with notoriously corrupt real estate developers. I saw the wives of plastic surgeons wearing dresses that cost more than a luxury sedan, sizing each other up with cold, calculating eyes. They complimented each other's diamond rings while secretly judging the obvious facial injections and forced smiles. It was a suffocating atmosphere of new money where everyone was desperately terrified that someone else might be slightly richer than they were. My mother Brenda was buzzing through the crowd like a frantic queen bee. She was ensuring every glass was full, and every conversation eventually steered toward Jasmine's incredible accomplishments. She laughed entirely too loud at jokes that were not funny, and touched the arms of powerful men with calculated familiarity. I watched her practically corner the managing partner of Atlanta's most prestigious corporate law firm, aggressively hinting that Jasmine would be a perfect fit for their executive team. It was humiliating to witness. She was peddling her daughter like a piece of high-end real estate to the highest bidder, completely blind to the fact that her own house was already burning down around her. My father Richard emerged from the house shortly after his disastrous meeting with me in the study. He had clearly taken a moment to compose himself. His face was no longer a dangerous shade of purple, but rather the perfectly flushed pink of a proud patriarch. He grabbed a fresh glass of scotch from a passing tray and immediately inserted himself into a circle of wealthy investors, laughing robustly and clapping them on the shoulder. He was playing the role of the fearless, successful titan of industry, masking the absolute terror I had seen in his eyes just 10 minutes ago. It was a masterclass in psychological compartmentalization. I stood silently in the shadows, watching the charade unfold. These were the people my father was terrified of losing. These were the sycophants my mother spent her entire life trying to impress. They were a flock of beautifully dressed vultures waiting to pick the bones of anyone who showed the slightest hint of financial weakness. They had absolutely no idea that the extravagant party they were currently enjoying was entirely funded by toxic debt and fraudulent accounting. They were drinking expensive champagne on the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. Suddenly, the soft background music provided by the live jazz quartet came to an abrupt halt. A sharp collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of hushed, expectant whispers. I looked toward the grand, sweeping stone staircase that led from the second-floor balcony down to the main pool deck. The heavy glass doors slid open, and my sister Jasmine finally made her highly anticipated appearance. She stood at the top of the stairs, pausing just long enough to ensure every single pair of eyes on the patio was firmly locked onto her. She was wearing a custom-tailored white silk designer dress that clung perfectly to her figure, paired with towering designer heels that flashed their signature red soles with every step she took. Her hair was styled in flawless cascading waves, and a massive diamond tennis bracelet sparkled aggressively on her wrist. She looked exactly like royalty descending from her high tower, to bless the commoners with her absolute perfection. Jamal was standing right beside her, puffing his chest out so far, he looked completely ridiculous. He held her arm, presenting her to the crowd like a shiny, expensive trophy he had just won at a carnival. He beamed with the unearned pride of a man who firmly believed his financial future was permanently secured by his wife's brand-new law degree. The crowd erupted into enthusiastic applause. Women cheered and men raised their crystal champagne flutes high into the air. Jasmine began her slow, deliberate descent down the stone steps, soaking in the adoration, like a plant drinking in the sun. She smiled that perfect practiced smile, waving gracefully to the guests as if she had single-handedly cured a major disease, instead of simply graduating from law school using our father's massive strategic donations. I watched her glide through the crowd, her fake humility on full display. "Oh, thank you so much," she cooed to a federal judge as he kissed her cheek. "I worked so incredibly hard for this," she lied to a banking executive who patted her on the back. Every word out of her mouth was a carefully rehearsed script designed to reinforce the golden child narrative my parents had meticulously built for her. She had absolutely no idea what it actually meant to struggle. She had never stayed up until 3 in the morning poring over complex financial models, trying to save a failing startup company. She had never had a door slammed in her face because she lacked the proper pedigree or the right last name. Her entire life, from her luxury cars to her luxury education, had been handed to her on a silver platter, paid for with money my father did not actually possess. As Jasmine continued her victory lap around the pool deck, laughing loudly and tossing her perfect hair, I felt a strange sense of profound calm wash over my entire body. The stark contrast between the glittering reality she thought she was living and the catastrophic truth I was holding in my purse was almost poetic. She was floating on a fragile bubble of absolute delusion. Through the shifting crowd, she finally spotted me standing alone in the deep shadows of the palm tree. For a brief, fleeting second, her perfect smile faltered. Her eyes narrowed and her chin tilted up just a fraction of an inch, a silent, deeply ingrained gesture of absolute superiority. She looked at the wet champagne stain on my modest-looking navy dress, and a look of profound disgust crossed her features. She turned her back to me, instantly dismissing my existence and returning her full attention to a wealthy socialite who was aggressively complimenting her expensive shoes. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water. "Enjoy the applause, Jasmine," I thought to myself, letting the cold liquid cool my throat. "Enjoy the designer dress and the adoring crowd. Soak up every single second of this beautiful, magnificent lie. Because the clock is ticking, and the man with the red envelope is already walking through the front gates." The sharp, distinct chime of silver striking crystal cut through the heavy, humid air of the pool deck. The low hum of wealthy socialites gossiping immediately faded into a respectful silence. The live jazz quartet stopped playing mid-measure, lowering their brass instruments. I watched from the deep shade of the imported palm tree as my father stepped onto a small elevated platform near the towering ice sculptures. He held a microphone in one hand and a freshly poured glass of vintage champagne in the other. He looked completely in his element. This was the stage Richard lived for. He loved commanding the attention of the Atlanta elite. He loved holding court and projecting the absolute illusion of invincibility. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep baritone voice echoing through the expensive outdoor sound system. "Esteemed colleagues and cherished friends, thank you all for joining us on this magnificent afternoon. Today, we are not just celebrating a graduation, we are celebrating the continuation of a profound family legacy." He gestured grandly toward Jasmine, who was standing right at the front of the crowd, flanked by her husband Jamal. Jasmine beamed, flashing her perfectly whitened teeth and pressing her hands to her chest in a practiced display of overwhelming gratitude. "When I look at my youngest daughter," Richard continued, his voice thick with exaggerated emotion, "I see the absolute pinnacle of excellence. I see a young woman who looked at the impossible standards of Harvard Law School and conquered them with unparalleled brilliance. She is a testament to what happens when supreme intelligence meets unwavering dedication. Let us raise our glasses to Jasmine, the newest and brightest legal mind in the state of Georgia." The crowd erupted into enthusiastic cheers. Crystal flutes clinked together, and a chorus of congratulations washed over the patio. I took another slow sip of my sparkling water, keeping my face entirely blank. It took every ounce of my professional self-control not to laugh out loud at his ridiculous speech. Supreme intelligence, unwavering dedication. The reality of Jasmine's academic career was a fiercely guarded family secret that I had uncovered years ago while auditing my father's personal financial statements. Jasmine did not conquer Harvard. Richard bought it for her. She had bombed her entrance exams twice. Her undergraduate grades were aggressively mediocre. To secure her admission, my father had quietly funneled $3.5 million into the University Alumni Endowment Fund, disguised as a massive charitable contribution for a new legal research center. Furthermore, she did not breeze through the rigorous program. It took her 4 agonizing years to complete a standard 3-year degree, and she only managed to pass her final exams because Richard secretly hired 2 senior paralegals from his corporate firm to ghostwrite her primary thesis. The most pathetic part of the entire charade was how he funded that $3 million donation. He did not use liquid cash. He leveraged the employee pension fund of his own communications company, taking out the exact same high-interest shadow loans that were currently triggering his federal bankruptcy. He had literally destroyed the livelihoods of his own employees just so his golden child could walk across a stage and frame a piece of paper she did not earn. As the applause began to die down, Richard raised his hand, signaling for quiet. His smile shifted from proud to something sharp and deeply calculating. His eyes scanned the crowd, looking past the politicians and the wealthy investors until his gaze locked directly onto me standing in the shadows. "You know, achieving this kind of greatness requires incredible perspective," he said, speaking directly into the microphone. His voice took on a philosophical, patronizing tone. "In business as in life, you cannot truly appreciate success unless you have a clear, undeniable picture of what failure looks like. You need a baseline. You need a cautionary tale to remind you of the consequences of mediocrity." My mother Brenda, who was standing near the front row, suddenly stiffened. She looked back at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of anticipation and malice. She knew exactly what Richard was about to do. The crowd naturally followed my father's gaze. 200 pairs of eyes shifted away from the glittering pool and the towering ice sculptures to focus on the woman standing alone under the palm tree, wearing a damp, unbranded navy dress. The physical weight of their collective stares was heavy, but I refused to shrink back into the shadows. I stood perfectly straight, holding my glass. "I want to take a moment to acknowledge my eldest daughter, Nia," Richard announced, his voice booming over the speakers. A thick, uncomfortable silence descended over the patio. People shifted awkwardly on their feet. "Nia has always marched to the beat of her own very slow drum." He continued, a cruel, mocking smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "While Jasmine was studying constitutional law, Nia was perfectly content filing paperwork in a cubicle. While Jasmine was building a network of powerful allies, Nia was renting economy cars to drive across town. But I realized something recently. I realized that Nia serves a very vital purpose in our family ecosystem." He took a dramatic pause, letting the absolute humiliation of his words hang in the hot air. "Every great achiever needs a stepping stone," he declared, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Every winner needs to see a loser to understand the stakes of the game. So I want to publicly thank you, Nia. Thank you for showing your sister exactly what happens when you lack ambition. Thank you for being the living, breathing example of what not to do with your life. Your failure was the exact motivation Jasmine needed to strive for absolute greatness. Without your disappointing example, she might not be standing here today." For a moment, nobody moved. The insult was so brazen, so breathtakingly cruel, and so completely unprovoked that it shocked even the most cynical socialites in the crowd. They were accustomed to backhanded compliments and passive-aggressive whispers behind closed doors. But watching a prominent patriarch publicly verbally execute his own daughter on a microphone was something entirely different. Then Jamal broke the silence. He let out a loud, obnoxious, barking laugh that echoed aggressively across the water. That single laugh served as a permission slip for the rest of the crowd. A low, awkward ripple of chuckles swept through the patio. Some guests laughed nervously, desperate to appease their wealthy host. Others, specifically the wives of the board members who had always viewed me as an oddity, openly snickered behind their manicured hands. My mother smiled a tight, satisfied smirk, looking at me as if I were a stain on the travertine tile that finally needed to be scrubbed away. Jasmine simply preened, fluffing her hair and soaking in the toxic validation. They all stood there laughing at the quiet sister. They all agreed with the narrative that I was a pathetic, useless spinster who served only as a dark backdrop for Jasmine's brilliant light. They expected me to break. They expected my face to crumble into tears. They expected me to drop my glass turnaround and run out of the service gates in absolute shame, just like the terrified little girl they remembered. I did none of those things. I did not break eye contact with my father. I did not flush with embarrassment. I simply raised my glass of sparkling water a few inches into the air, offering him a silent mock toast. My complete lack of reaction seemed to unnerve him slightly. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing in confusion. He was a bully who thrived on the pain of his victims, and my absolute emotional detachment robbed him of his desired payoff. But his monumental ego quickly recovered. He turned his back to me, dismissing me entirely, and addressed the crowd once more. But enough about the past, he boomed his voice, returning to its jovial, booming cadence. Today is about the future. Today is about rewarding absolute excellence. Jasmine, my beautiful, brilliant daughter, please step forward. It is time for your real graduation gift. I slowly lowered my glass. The public humiliation was complete. Richard had just used his final moments of perceived power to dig his own grave 10 feet deeper. He had established his absolute cruelty on a public stage in front of every single person who mattered in his shallow world. It was the perfect setup. He had built his pedestal as high as it could possibly go, which meant the impending fall was going to shatter him completely. I glanced toward the heavy wrought iron gates at the front of the property. The wait was finally over. Richard turned away from me and raised his hands high into the air, signaling to a pair of event staff standing near the edge of the sprawling travertine patio. The two men immediately rushed toward a massive object sitting just beyond the pool area, which had been carefully hidden beneath a shimmering silver silk tarp for the entire afternoon. The crowd collectively held its breath, shifting their attention away from my dark corner and focusing entirely on the spectacle about to unfold. "This is for you, my brilliant girl Richard," announced his voice echoing across the water. "A small token to ensure you arrive at your new law firm in the style you absolutely deserve." He snapped his fingers. The two staff members gripped the corners of the silver silk and pulled backward in one fluid, synchronized motion. The tarp slid away to reveal a brand new, gleaming white Lamborghini Urus. The luxury super SUV sat there looking like an aggressive piece of modern art, parked right in the middle of our manicured gardens. The brilliant Georgia sunlight caught the sharp aerodynamic lines of the vehicle reflecting off the pristine white paint and highlighting the massive custom black alloy wheels. The interior, visible through the lightly tinted windows, was an explosion of deeply rich crimson-red leather. It was a vehicle designed entirely for people who wanted to scream their wealth at everyone they passed on the street. The crowd of Atlanta elites erupted into a frenzy of applause and exaggerated gasps. Wives of corporate executives clapped their hands in delight, while the men let out low whistles of genuine appreciation. But nobody reacted quite like my brother-in-law Jamal. Jamal practically shoved Jasmine aside in his haste to get to the vehicle. He sprinted across the patio, his velvet blazer flapping wildly behind him, and threw his hands onto the hood of the Lamborghini as if he were claiming a newly discovered continent. He pressed his face against the driver's side window, peering at the steering wheel and the carbon fiber dashboard with a look of pure, unadulterated greed. He was practically vibrating with excitement, entirely forgetting that the car was supposed to be a graduation gift for his wife. To Jamal, Jasmine's success was simply a joint bank account he had full access to. Jasmine followed him at a much slower, more calculated pace. She pressed both hands over her mouth, feigning a look of absolute overwhelming shock. She looked back at Richard, tears welling up in her eyes perfectly on cue. She performed the role of the incredibly grateful, overwhelmed daughter flawlessly. My mother Brenda rushed forward and threw her arms around Jasmine, hugging her tightly, while making sure the event photographer got a clear shot of their touching family moment standing directly in front of the luxury vehicle. Richard walked down from his elevated platform, holding a sleek black velvet box. He approached Jasmine, opened the box, and retrieved a heavy metallic key fob, placing it directly into the palm of her hand. "But I am not finished yet," Richard boomed, speaking loudly so the crowd could still hear him without the microphone. "A car is just a way to get around, it is a tool. But a true legacy requires a solid, permanent foundation. It requires a fortress." The patio fell entirely silent once again. Even Jamal managed to pull his eyes away from the crimson leather interior of the Lamborghini, turning to look at his father-in-law with wide, hungry eyes. Richard reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a thick, dark mahogany leather binder. The binder had a heavy gold seal pressed into the front cover. He held it up high, making sure the sunlight caught the gold embossing so every wealthy investor and politician on the deck could see the official legal nature of the document. Jasmine, Richard said, his voice dropping into a register of profound, serious emotion. "You are the future of this family. You are the one who will carry our name into the next generation of Atlanta high society. You need a home that reflects your massive achievements. You need a place where you can host your own clients and build your own empire." He took a step forward and placed the heavy leather binder on top of the Lamborghini key fob in Jasmine's hands. "Contained in this binder is the official deed to this very estate," Richard declared, his chest puffed out with maximum pride. $17 million of prime Buckhead real estate. The house, the grounds, the pool. Everything you see around you is now completely free and clear in your name. Happy graduation, Jasmine. This kingdom is officially yours. The crowd absolutely lost their minds. They cheered, they stomped their expensive leather shoes against the travertine tile, and they raised their champagne glasses in a massive, chaotic toast. Giving a 28-year-old a luxury car was one thing, but signing over a $17 million estate was a display of financial dominance that cemented Richard's status as an untouchable titan of industry in their eyes. Brenda began openly weeping, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Jasmine clutched the heavy leather binder to her chest, her face a mask of triumphant joy. Jamal threw his arms around the air, shouting his victory to the sky, already imagining the lavish parties he was going to throw in his brand-new mansion. I stood in the deep, cooling shade of the imported palm tree, watching the spectacular circus unfold with absolute clinical detachment. The sheer audacity of my father's lie was breathtaking. I looked at the gleaming white Lamborghini Urus and felt a sharp wave of amusement. The vehicle was not bought. It was leased through a high-risk commercial auto broker under a rapidly dissolving shell corporation. The lease agreement was secured by the very same fraudulent accounting I had confronted him about in the study. The dealership would be sending a flatbed tow truck to repossess that car the moment Richard's primary company officially defaulted, which was going to happen in exactly 10 minutes. Then I looked at the heavy mahogany leather binder Jasmine was hugging so tightly. That binder was nothing more than a prop. The papers inside were utterly worthless pieces of decorative stationery. Richard could not legally transfer the deed to the estate because Richard did not own the estate anymore. Every single brick, every blade of grass, every drop of water in that lotus-filled pool belonged to my private equity firm. I had personally signed the foreclosure acquisition documents 3 days ago. Richard was standing on my property, giving away my house to a woman who had spent her entire life making me feel completely worthless. Jasmine pulled away from her mother and her husband. She held the keys in one hand and the heavy binder in the other. The crowd parted for her as she began to walk around the perimeter of the pool, soaking in the congratulations and the envious stares of her peers. People reached out to touch her arm, congratulating her on her unbelievable fortune. She nodded and smiled, playing the gracious, newly crowned queen. But her victory lap had a very specific, deliberate destination. She broke away from the main cluster of guests and began walking directly toward the dark corner of the patio where I was standing. The bright, joyous smile on her face slowly melted away as she stepped out of the glaring sunlight and into the shade of the palm tree with me. She stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. Up close, I could smell the heavy, expensive designer perfume she wore mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of her own adrenaline. She looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on the damp champagne stain on my modest navy dress. She held up the Lamborghini keys, letting the metal fob dangle and catch the light. Then she tapped the thick leather binder against my arm. "Look at this, Nia," she said, her voice dropping into a harsh, venomous whisper that only the two of us could hear. "Look at what happens when you actually matter to people. Look at what you get when you are not a complete embarrassment." I kept my face perfectly still, looking directly into her bright blue eyes. I did not step back. I did not flinch. "You came here today in a rented economy car wearing a wet rag." Jasmine continued her words, slicing through the air with practiced cruelty. "You stood there and let Dad humiliate you in front of the most important people in this city, and you did not even have the self-respect to defend yourself. You just took it. Because you know it is true." She leaned in closer, her face inches from mine. The mask of the sweet, perfect daughter was entirely gone, replaced by the vicious, arrogant monster my parents had spent 28 years carefully cultivating. "You will always be the stepping stone I walk on." She whispered, every syllable dripping with absolute malice. "You are nothing, Nia. You have nothing. You will die with nothing. Now get off my patio before I call my valet to have your cheap rental car towed out of my neighborhood." She pulled back, flashing me one final victorious smirk. She turned on her designer heel, ready to march back into the sunlight and continue ruling her newly acquired kingdom. The conflict had reached its absolute highest peak. The cruelty was completely unmasked. The family I was born into had taken their final shot, draining every last drop of poison they had left directly into my face. I looked over Jasmine's shoulder, past the glowing white Lamborghini and the cheering crowd of fake friends. Through the heavy wrought iron gates at the very front of the $17 million property, I saw the sleek black grille of a massive corporate SUV pulling into the driveway. I smiled. A genuine, warm, peaceful smile. "I am not going anywhere, Jasmine," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying a weight that made her pause mid-step. "Because the real party is just about to start." Jasmine let out a sharp, dismissive scoff, taking a step back from me. She shook her perfectly styled hair and looked at me as if I were a delusional patient who had just escaped from a hospital ward. She opened her mouth, preparing to deliver another string of rehearsed, venomous insults, but the words never had a chance to leave her lips. A loud, aggressive screech of metal abruptly shattered the celebratory atmosphere of the afternoon. The heavy custom-wrought iron gates at the main entrance of the estate, the ones my mother had expressly ordered locked to keep the commoners away, did not simply swing open. They were violently forced apart by the massive black steel grille of a modified armored Cadillac Escalade. The luxury tactical vehicle ignored the frantic waving of the young valet attendants. It did not slow down to ask for permission. It drove directly onto the pristine circular driveway, the heavy tires crushing the decorative white gravel with a deeply satisfying aggressive crunch. The jazz quartet on the patio immediately stopped playing. The low hum of wealthy socialites gossiping died in an instant. 200 pairs of eyes snapped toward the front of the property, watching in stunned silence as the Escalade threw itself into park directly behind Jasmine's brand-new rented Lamborghini. The driver's side door opened first. A towering man wearing a dark tactical suit stepped out, his eyes scanning the perimeter with the cold, detached precision of a former military operative. He walked swiftly around the rear of the vehicle and pulled open the passenger side door. Out stepped Mr. Crawford. Even from 50 yards away, standing in the deep shade of the imported palm tree, I could feel the immediate shift in the atmospheric pressure of the entire estate. Mr. Crawford was 55 years old, a distinguished African-American man with closely cropped silver hair and eyes that possessed the warmth of a frozen lake. He was wearing a bespoke charcoal gray suit that was tailored with such flawless, lethal precision, it made every other wealthy man on the patio look like they were wearing cheap, borrowed clothing. In his left hand, he carried a sleek black leather briefcase. In his right hand, he held a thick, heavy envelope sealed with bright red wax. He radiated the kind of absolute, terrifying power that you cannot fake with leased cars or loud behavior. He was the apex predator of the corporate legal world, and he had just stepped into a backyard full of noisy, colorful birds. My parents' head of private security, a bulky man stuffed into a poorly fitting blazer, rushed forward from his post near the catering tent. He held his hand up, signaling for Mr. Crawford to stop. "Sir, this is a private event," the guard barked, puffing his chest out to appear intimidating. "You need to turn your vehicle around right now." Mr. Crawford did not break his stride. He did not slow down. He did not even blink. He simply kept walking forward with the unstoppable momentum of a freight train. His tactical driver smoothly stepped directly into the security guard's path, planting a heavy hand firmly in the center of the guard's chest and shoving him backward into the manicured hedges with effortless, terrifying ease. The message was instantly clear to everyone watching: do not interfere. Mr. Crawford stepped off the driveway and onto the glaring white travertine tile of the pool deck. His expensive leather shoes struck the stone with a rhythmic, authoritative click that echoed across the silent water. The crowd of Atlanta elites naturally instinctively parted for him. They fell back, pulling their silk dresses and custom jackets out of his way, parting like the Red Sea before a hurricane. They recognized real power when they saw it, and they were absolutely terrified of getting caught in its path. Jamal, however, was entirely too arrogant and far too foolish to read the room. Seeing an unfamiliar man disrupting his moment of glory, Jamal decided he needed to assert his dominance in front of his new high society friends. He practically sprinted away from the Lamborghini, his ridiculous velvet blazer flapping in the humid air. He marched directly into Mr. Crawford's path, spreading his arms wide to block the walkway. "Hey, old man," Jamal shouted, his voice cracking slightly with unearned bravado. "Who do you think you are, just barging in here? This is my wife's graduation party. We are celebrating. You need to take your driver and get off my property before I have you arrested for trespassing." Jamal reached out a hand, attempting to aggressively shove Mr. Crawford in the shoulder. It was the absolute worst mistake of his entirely pathetic life. Before Jamal's hand could even make contact, Mr. Crawford stopped. He turned his head slowly, locking his cold, lifeless gaze directly onto Jamal's face. The older attorney did not raise his voice. He did not need to shout to establish dominance. He spoke in a low, smooth baritone that somehow carried perfectly across the dead silent patio. "If you touch my suit," Mr. Crawford said, his voice dripping with absolute lethal calm, "I will have my team legally sever your hand from your wrist, and I will bankrupt whatever distant relatives you have left, just to pay for the surgical cleanup. Step aside, little boy. You are standing in the way of actual business." Jamal physically recoiled. All the blood instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking pale and deeply nauseous. His tough guy persona completely shattered under the weight of a man who actually destroyed lives for a living. Jamal stumbled backward, nearly tripping over his own expensive shoes, and practically hid behind one of the melting ice sculptures. Mr. Crawford adjusted his silk tie and continued his march across the pool deck. Richard stepped forward, his face a mask of total confusion and rising panic. He had spent decades rubbing elbows with the wealthy elite of Atlanta, but he knew he did not invite this man. He recognized the heavy aura of corporate consequence rolling off Mr. Crawford. Richard opened his mouth, raising his hands in a placating gesture, preparing to use his charm to de-escalate whatever crisis had just walked through his front gates. "Excuse me, sir." Richard started pasting on his best country club smile. "I am Richard, the owner of this estate. If there is some kind of misunderstanding with my company, we can discuss it in my private study. Mr. Crawford did not even look at him. He simply walked straight past my father, treating the supposedly powerful patriarch of the family exactly like a piece of decorative patio furniture. He walked past the gleaming white Lamborghini. He walked past my mother, who was clutching her pearl necklace in absolute horror. He walked right past Jasmine, who was standing completely frozen with her useless leather binder pressed against her chest. The entire hierarchy of my family was completely ignored, dismantled by a man who refused to acknowledge their existence. Mr. Crawford walked directly into the shadows beneath the towering palm tree. He stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. The imposing, terrifying corporate shark, who had just silenced 200 of the most powerful people in the city, squared his broad shoulders, looked me directly in the eyes, and offered a deep, highly respectful bow. "I apologize for the delay, ma'am," Mr. Crawford said, his voice carrying clearly over the hushed whispers of the terrified crowd. "The federal judge required a physical signature to finalize the asset transfer, but the acquisitions are now completely secured." The collective gasp that rippled across the pool deck was the sweetest sound I had ever heard in my entire life. The collective gasp hung in the humid air like a thick fog. 200 people who had spent the entire afternoon ignoring my existence were suddenly staring at me with a mixture of absolute shock and morbid fascination. Mr. Crawford stood perfectly still, holding the heavy envelope out toward me. The thick red wax seal stamped with the unmistakable crest of my private equity firm gleamed in the harsh Georgia sunlight. "The acquisitions are finalized, Mom," Mr. Crawford repeated, his voice carrying a dark, heavy finality that echoed across the silent pool deck. He did not say it for my benefit. He said it loud enough for the front row of wealthy investors and corporate executives to hear exactly what was happening. He wanted them to know that the power dynamic on this patio had just violently shifted. I reached out and took the envelope from his hand. The thick, high-quality parchment felt incredibly heavy. It contained the absolute destruction of my parents' entire superficial universe. For 35 years, I had allowed this family to dictate my worth. I had allowed them to force me through service entrances, insult my clothing, and parade my sister around as the golden standard while treating me like a shameful secret. I had spent my entire childhood shrinking myself so they could feel large. I placed my thumb against the heavy red wax seal and pressed down. The sharp, crisp snap of the wax breaking sounded like a gunshot in the dead, silent air of the estate. That single sound was the exact moment the pathetic, invisible daughter ceased to exist. The heavy, suffocating cloak of the family scapegoat, the woman who kept her head down and absorbed their endless cruelty, dissolved completely. In her place emerged the founder and chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar financial empire. My spine straightened, my shoulders pulled back. The polite, accommodating smile I had worn all afternoon vanished instantly, replaced by the cold, calculating stare of a predator who had finally cornered her prey. I pulled the thick stack of legal documents from the envelope. The crisp, white pages were covered in heavy black text and stamped with the official blue ink of the Federal Bankruptcy Court. I did not need to read them. I had personally drafted the hostile takeover strategy months ago. I simply held them in my hand, a physical manifestation of my absolute authority. I stepped out from the deep, cooling shade of the imported palm tree and into the glaring bright sunlight of the pool deck. Mr. Crawford immediately fell into step exactly 1 pace behind my right shoulder, his tactical presence a silent warning to anyone who even thought about interfering. The crowd of Atlanta elites, the very people who had been laughing at my father's cruel jokes just 5 minutes earlier, scrambled to get out of my way. They pulled their silk dresses and expensive bespoke suits tight against their bodies, giving me a wide berth as I walked toward the elevated platform. They looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, trying to reconcile the damp, unbranded navy dress I was wearing with the terrifying corporate power radiating from my every step. I walked past Jamal, who was still cowering behind a melting ice sculpture. He refused to make eye contact with me, staring intently at his own expensive shoes, his ridiculous velvet blazer suddenly looking incredibly cheap. I walked past Jasmine. She was standing frozen on the travertine tile, still clutching the useless leather binder to her chest, and dangling the keys to a leased Lamborghini she would never actually own. As I passed her, her mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The arrogant, venomous smirk she had worn just moments ago had completely melted off her face, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending panic. She tried to speak to ask me what was happening, but her throat was completely dry. I did not even turn my head to acknowledge her. She was no longer relevant. I walked past my mother, Brenda. Her heavy designer makeup could not hide the sudden gray pallor of her skin. She looked from Mr. Crawford to the federal documents in my hand, and then up to my face. For the first time in my entire life, my mother looked at me and saw someone she was truly deeply afraid of. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled as she clutched her pearl necklace, backing away from me, as if I were carrying a highly contagious disease. I reached the base of the small elevated platform where my father Richard was standing. He was no longer the jovial, booming patriarch who had just publicly humiliated me on a microphone. The confident titan of industry had completely vanished. He was sweating profusely, the moisture beading on his forehead and soaking into the collar of his expensive charcoal suit. His chest heaved with rapid, shallow breaths. He recognized the heavy red wax seal on the broken envelope. He recognized the official blue stamps on the federal court documents I was holding. And looking at Mr. Crawford, he finally realized that the massive anonymous private equity firm that had been ruthlessly buying up all of his catastrophic toxic debt for the past 8 months was entirely controlled by the daughter he had just called a complete failure. I slowly walked up the 3 wooden steps of the platform. Richard took a sudden, clumsy step backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping loudly against the wood. He was terrified. He tried to project authority, he tried to summon the decades of bullying and emotional manipulation he had always used to keep me in line, but his body fundamentally betrayed him. His hands were shaking so violently that the microphone he was holding rattled against the heavy gold ring on his finger. "Nia," he stammered, his deep voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. "Nia, what is this? What are you doing? Who is this man?" I stepped directly into his personal space, forcing him to look down into my eyes. I could smell the sharp, sour tang of his fear mingling with the expensive scotch on his breath. He was a hollow, brittle shell of a man entirely propped up by stolen money and fake prestige. I did not answer his frantic questions. I did not yell. I did not justify my presence. I simply raised my left hand and reached out toward the microphone he was clutching like a life preserver. He tried to hold on to it. His white knuckles gripped the black plastic, his mind desperately trying to maintain the last shred of his public authority. But his resistance was incredibly weak. He had absolutely no real power left. I wrapped my fingers around the smooth handle of the microphone directly over his shaking hand and applied a slow, steady, unstoppable pressure. I looked completely through him, my eyes stripping away his expensive suit and his fake country club smile, exposing the pathetic, desperate fraud underneath. "Let it go, Richard," I said, my voice a low, icy whisper that only he could hear. "You do not have a voice anymore." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously in his thick throat. Slowly, agonizingly, his fingers uncurled. He released his grip, stepping back and wrapping his arms around his own chest in a deeply subconscious gesture of self-protection. I took the microphone from his hand. The physical transfer of the device was the absolute ultimate shift in power. He had used this exact microphone to publicly execute my character. He had used it to elevate Jasmine to the status of a queen while burying me in the dirt. Now I was holding the weapon and I was going to use it to burn his entire fake kingdom to the ground. I turned away from my trembling father and faced the massive crowd of Atlanta elites. 200 people stood perfectly motionless, holding their crystal champagne flutes and their silver plates of caviar, waiting in absolute, breathless silence. The only sound on the entire estate was the gentle splashing of the water from the pool filters and the low hum of the idling tactical Escalade parked in the driveway. I raised the microphone to my lips and tapped the metal grill twice with my index finger. The sharp percussive thumps echoed loudly through the massive outdoor speakers bouncing off the limestone facade of the $17 million mansion. I looked down at Jasmine, who was staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. Then I looked at the gleaming white Lamborghini Urus. Finally, my gaze swept across the crowd of wealthy investors, politicians, and socialites who had laughed at my expense. I held the federal bankruptcy documents up high so every single person on the patio could clearly see the blue ink and the red wax seal. The era of my silence was officially permanently over. My father loves to talk about foundations. I began, my voice perfectly steady and amplified across the sprawling $17 million property. He loves to talk about building a legacy and setting an example for the next generation. So today I think it is only fitting that we take a very close look at the actual foundation this family is currently standing on. I looked directly at the managing partners of the local banks, the real estate developers, and the influential politicians who had spent the last 3 hours drinking our vintage champagne. Richard is a phenomenal storyteller. I continued pacing slowly across the elevated wooden platform. For the past decade, he has convinced all of you that his communications empire is thriving. He has hosted charity galas, he has sponsored your golf tournaments, and he has projected the image of a fearless, untouchable titan of industry. But the absolute truth is, his company has been completely insolvent for over a year. 8 months ago, he secretly filed for Chapter 11, bankruptcy protection in federal court. A sharp collective gasp swept through the 200 guests. The silence that followed was so profound, I could hear the gentle rustling of the palm leaves above me. Richard lunged forward, his face a mask of sheer panic. "Naya, shut your mouth," he hissed desperately, reaching for the microphone cord. "You are ruining everything." Before his fingers could even graze the black wire, Mr. Crawford stepped effortlessly between us. The imposing corporate attorney did not say a single word. He simply placed his large hand flat against my father's chest and shoved him backward with enough force to send Richard stumbling down the 3 wooden stairs of the platform. Richard hit the travertine tile hard, landing on his hands and knees right in front of the very investors he had been lying to all afternoon. To maintain the illusion of his massive wealth, I said, never breaking my eye contact with the crowd, he systematically drained the employee pension funds of his own company. He stole the retirement savings of the people who worked for him. He took out massive high-interest shadow loans from unregulated lenders just to pay for Jasmine's Harvard admission because she absolutely could not get in on her own academic merit. The crowd immediately shifted. The wealthy elite of Atlanta were ruthless when it came to financial failure. They tolerated arrogance, they tolerated cruelty, but they absolutely despised bad debt. I watched as 3 prominent banking executives immediately turned their backs on my father, stepping away from him as if he were suddenly highly radioactive. Jasmine let out a high-pitched, wounded noise. Her perfect posture completely collapsed. She looked around at the judging eyes of her peers, her face flushing a deep, humiliating shade of red. The narrative of her supreme intelligence, the story she had built her entire identity around, was completely shattered in front of her new wealthy in-laws. "But my father was not finished lying to you today," I continued, turning my attention toward the gleaming white super SUV parked on the driveway. "That beautiful Lamborghini you are all admiring is not a graduation gift. It is a commercial vehicle leased under a rapidly dissolving shell corporation." I looked directly at Jamal, who was still hiding near the melting ice sculpture. "The initial deposit on that lease bounced 3 days ago," I informed him, my voice dripping with absolute cold precision. "The dealership dispatched a flatbed tow truck this morning. It should be arriving at the front gates any minute to repossess that vehicle." "You might want to step away from it, Jamal, before the repo men think you are the one responsible for the fraudulent paperwork." Jamal physically recoiled from the car as if the white paint had suddenly caught fire. He looked at his wife with a mixture of absolute disgust and betrayal, realizing that the golden ticket he thought he had married was actually a massive financial sinkhole. But the absolute masterpiece of my father's delusion is the heavy leather binder my sister is currently clutching, I said, returning my gaze to Jasmine. Jasmine looked down at her hands, her fingers trembling against the dark mahogany leather. Richard just stood on this platform and told all of you he was signing over the deed to this $17 million estate. I announced, my voice echoing clearly over the water. He told you it was completely free and clear. He handed her the keys to her new kingdom. He lied. 10 months ago, the primary bank initiated absolute foreclosure proceedings on this property. They shopped the toxic debt around to various private equity firms, hoping anyone would buy the massive liability Richard had created. My mother Brenda let out a loud, ragged sob. She collapsed into one of the expensive patio chairs, burying her face in her hands. Her entire life, her entire carefully constructed social standing was evaporating right in front of her eyes. A private equity firm in Manhattan finally stepped in and bought the debt I explained, holding the federal court documents up higher. They bought the mortgage on this house. They bought the failing loans keeping Richard's company afloat. They even bought the personal credit card debt of my dear brother-in-law, Jamal. I paused, letting the heavy silence stretch out. I looked at the faces of my family members, the people who had spent 35 years calling me the dumb one, the failure, the embarrassing disappointment. That private equity firm is called Vanguard Holdings, I declared, projecting my voice so it reached the furthest corners of the manicured gardens. And I am its founder, its chief executive officer, and its sole owner. The shockwave that hit the patio was a physical, tangible force. People literally took a step backward. The whispers erupted instantly, a chaotic buzz of wealthy people trying to process the absolute impossibility of the situation. The quiet, unbranded sister, the woman they had all just publicly laughed at, was secretly a billionaire financial predator. Jasmine dropped the leather binder. It hit the travertine tile with a heavy, dull thud. The fake decorative papers spilled out across the stone, completely useless. I bought this family out of bankruptcy. I continued, my voice rising above the chaotic murmurs of the crowd. But I did not buy it to save them. I bought it to finally hold them accountable. Every single brick of this mansion, every blade of grass on this lawn, and the very travertine tile you are all standing on belongs entirely to me. I am the sole legal owner of this property. I walked down the wooden steps of the platform and stepped directly over my father, who was still kneeling on the ground, staring up at me with hollow, defeated eyes. "You cannot gift this house to Jasmine Richard," I said, looking down at him with absolute clinical pity. "You cannot give away what you do not own. You are standing on my property, and I do not allow tenants who disrespect the landlord." Jasmine suddenly rushed forward, her designer heels clicking frantically against the stone. She grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into my skin. "You cannot do this to me!" she screamed, her voice cracking into a hysterical pitch. "This is my day. This is my graduation party. You are just jealous. You are a liar. Mom, tell her she is lying." I looked at Jasmine's hand gripping my arm. I did not pull away. I simply stared at her fingers until she realized exactly who she was touching. She was touching the woman who owned her entire existence. She slowly uncurled her fingers and stepped back, her chest heaving with panicked breaths. "You called me your stepping stone, Jasmine," I said, my voice low and terrifyingly calm. "You told me I was nothing. But the truth is, you have spent your entire life standing on a stage built completely on sand. And the tide just came in." I turned away from her and looked out at the 200 guests. They were completely frozen, unsure if they should leave or continue watching the absolute destruction of a prominent Atlanta family. "The party is officially over," I announced, dropping the microphone onto the platform, where it let out a loud, high-pitched squeal of feedback. "Please locate your vehicles and exit the property immediately." I signaled to Mr. Crawford, who pulled a small radio from his suit jacket and spoke a single command. Within seconds, 3 more black tactical SUVs pulled through the front gates, blocking the driveway entirely. A dozen men in sharp, dark suits stepped out, moving with aggressive military precision. My private security team had officially arrived to secure my newly acquired real estate. The wealthy guests did not need to be told twice. The mass exodus was instantaneous. Politicians and corporate executives scrambled toward the side gates, abandoning their crystal champagne flutes and their silver plates of caviar on the patio tables. They rushed past the sinking ice sculptures, desperate to distance themselves from Richard's toxic radioactive failure. They knew the rules of the game better than anyone. When the money vanished, so did the loyalty. I stood in the center of the patio, watching the fake friends and the sycophants run for the exits. The era of the invisible ghost sister was completely dead and buried. I had taken the bricks they threw at me for 35 years, and I had used them to crush their entire empire. The sheer velocity at which high society turns on a fallen member is a truly spectacular phenomenon to witness. One moment my father was the undisputed king of the Buckhead elite, and the very next he was a highly infectious disease that everyone was desperately trying to escape. The initial stunned silence on the patio shattered into a million frantic pieces, giving way to absolute utter chaos. It started with the distinct sound of fine crystal shattering. A wealthy real estate developer standing near the front row simply opened his hand, letting his expensive champagne flute drop and smash against the travertine tile. He did not apologize. He did not look back. He grabbed his wife's arm and power-walked toward the exit, muttering furious curses under his breath. That single broken glass acted as the starting gun for the mass exodus. The low murmurs of shock rapidly escalated into loud, aggressive accusations. These were not loyal friends. These were transactional business partners, investors, and politicians who had tied their own public reputations to Richard's supposed financial invincibility. Recognizing that they were currently standing at ground zero of a massive federal bankruptcy scandal, they went into immediate, intense damage control. I watched Harrison, a senior executive at the largest commercial bank in Atlanta, march directly up to the edge of the wooden platform. His face was twisted in an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Richard, tell me right now that she is making this up," Harrison demanded, his voice cutting through the rising panic of the crowd. "Tell me you did not leverage the Commercial Development Fund to hide your insolvency. Tell me you did not commit federal fraud." My father was still scrambling to get up from his hands and knees. His bespoke charcoal suit was wrinkled and covered in dust from the patio stones. The confident, booming patriarch was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, cornered old man, desperately trying to plug the holes in a sinking ship with his bare hands. "Harrison, please, you have to listen to me," Richard sputtered, waving his hands frantically in the air. His face was pale, a sickly grayish white that made him look 10 years older. "It is a misunderstanding. It is a temporary cash flow issue. Nia is exaggerating. She does not understand corporate restructuring. She is unwell, Harrison. She has always been deeply unstable. This is just a pathetic, jealous prank to ruin her sister's special day." He was actually trying to gaslight a senior banking executive. He was trying to use the exact same toxic manipulation tactics he had used on me my entire life. But Harrison was not a vulnerable child. Harrison was a man who analyzed risk for a living. Harrison looked at my father as if he were looking at a cockroach that had just crawled out of a sewer. "You are a dead man, Richard," he said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "Do not ever call my office again. If you step foot near my bank, I will have you arrested for trespassing before the federal agents even get to you." Harrison turned his back and joined the surging wave of guests rushing toward the side gates. The panic was deeply contagious. Women in custom silk dresses pushed past each other, abandoning their designer clutches on the tables in their desperate haste to flee. I heard Sylvia, a prominent local socialite, who had just been loudly praising my mother's taste in floral arrangements, actively mocking her as she ran. "I always knew they were living far beyond their means," Sylvia hissed to her husband, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Did you see the cheap catering back there? Absolute frauds. The entire family is a complete embarrassment. The hypocrisy was sick enough to choke on, but I simply stood there watching the rats flee the sinking ship. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. Richard realized his audience was vanishing. The powerful network he had spent 3 decades meticulously building was evaporating into thin air right in front of his eyes. He scrambled to his feet, completely abandoning any pretense of dignity. He ran down the steps of the platform and tried to physically grab the arms of the departing guests. "Wait, please do not leave," he begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "The party is not over. We are serving the main course in 20 minutes. I can explain everything. I am still the chief executive officer. I still own this town." People actively swatted his hands away. They looked at him with sheer revulsion, brushing their expensive jackets as if his touch had physically soiled them. "It is a lie," Richard screamed, his voice echoing wildly across the half-empty pool deck. He pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "Look at her. She is a low-level desk clerk. She takes the subway. She rents cheap cars. Do you honestly believe a woman who looks like that could buy a multi-million-dollar company? She printed those fake documents at a local copy shop. She is having a psychotic mental breakdown." He was screaming into the void. The guests were not listening to him, but his desperate, loud denials were starting to create a small pocket of confusion near the catering tents. A few of the older board members paused, looking back and forth between the ranting patriarch and the calm, silent woman standing next to the towering corporate attorney. Mr. Crawford did not tolerate confusion. He operated on absolute, undeniable facts. Without waiting for a command from me, Mr. Crawford unbuttoned his suit jacket and calmly walked over to the massive outdoor audiovisual control booth situated next to the ice sculptures. My parents had rented a state-of-the-art 80-inch outdoor LED screen, intending to use it to play a heavily edited, touching video montage of Jasmine's fake academic achievements. The screen was currently displaying a paused image of Jasmine smiling brightly in a graduation cap. Mr. Crawford bypassed the terrified teenage audiovisual technician who was cowering behind the soundboard. He reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a secure encrypted corporate tablet, and plugged it directly into the main projection feed. The massive LED screen flickered violently for a fraction of a second. The image of the smiling golden child vanished completely. In its place, illuminated in blinding high-definition resolution, was the first page of the federal Chapter 11 bankruptcy filing. The document was 50 feet wide. There was absolutely nowhere to look to escape it. Every single word was blown up to massive proportions. The heavy black text outlined the catastrophic debt of my father's communications company. The bright blue official stamp of the federal court sat perfectly in the top right corner. The watermark of the United States Treasury Department was embedded deeply into the digital parchment. But Mr. Crawford was a master of theatrical execution. He did not just show them the bankruptcy. He tapped the screen of his tablet, swiping to the next document in the legal sequence. The screen shifted, displaying the official notice of asset forfeiture. It listed the $17 million Buckhead estate, the private corporate jets, the secondary vacation homes, and the entire fleet of company vehicles. Right below that list, highlighted in bright, undeniable yellow digital marker, was the name of the purchasing entity, Vanguard Holdings, LLC. He swiped one more time. The final document appeared on the massive glowing screen. It was the Master Articles of Incorporation for Vanguard Holdings. It showed the official state registry, the corporate tax identification numbers, and the single absolute controlling signature at the very bottom of the page. It was my signature, my full legal name printed in bold black ink, listing me as the sole owner-founder and chief executive officer of the very firm that now owned every single thing my father had ever touched. The visual proof was absolute and devastating. There was no copying shop in the world that could forge federal watermarks and registered treasury seals on a massive high-definition display. The last remaining shred of Richard's desperate lie was completely incinerated by the glowing pixels on that screen. The few board members who had paused to listen to Richard's frantic excuses took one look at the massive projection and immediately broke into a panicked sprint toward the front gates. The valet stand turned into an absolute war zone with wealthy elites shouting and shoving each other out of the way to get their keys and escape the radioactive fallout of the estate. My father stopped screaming. He slowly turned his head, looking up at the towering LED screen. His mouth hung open. The color drained from his face so completely, I thought he might actually suffer a cardiac event right there on the travertine tile. The undeniable mathematical reality of his absolute failure was staring down at him 50 feet wide and bright as the sun. He dropped to his knees, his expensive trousers soaking up the spilled champagne on the stone. But it was my mother Brenda who provided the final heartbreaking soundtrack to the collapse of their fake empire. Brenda had been sitting slumped in a patio chair, paralyzed by the sheer shock of the situation. When the massive screen lit up, she slowly raised her head. She read the words, "Asset forfeiture." She saw the address of the mansion she had decorated with such arrogant pride listed as a seized property. She saw my signature at the bottom of the controlling document confirming that the daughter she had emotionally abused and hidden away like a dirty secret was now her absolute landlord. The reality finally violently punctured her bubble of delusion. Brenda let out a shriek. It was not a normal scream. It was a visceral, blood-curdling howl that tore from the very bottom of her lungs. It was the agonizing, desperate sound of a woman who had built her entire identity, her entire sense of self-worth, on the fragile illusion of wealth and social superiority. Without her country club memberships, without her designer clothes and her massive gated mansion, she was absolutely nothing. She was just an empty hollow shell, and the universe had just held up a giant mirror to show her the truth. She threw her hands up, gripping her perfectly styled hair and pulling at the expensive strands until her flawless helmet of perfection was a wild, tangled mess. She collapsed onto the stone deck next to my father, weeping hysterically and beating her manicured fists against the ground. She screamed about her friends, she screamed about her reputation, she screamed that her life was completely over. She did not cry for her husband. She did not cry for her daughters. She cried exclusively for the loss of her superficial status. I stood completely still, watching the two of them break down on the patio floor beneath the glowing evidence of their own destruction. The chaotic noise of the fleeing guests faded into the background, replaced entirely by the pathetic sobbing of the people who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. They were finally exactly where they belonged. As my mother continued to sob uncontrollably on the patio floor, the last few stragglers of the Atlanta elite finally hurried out of the wrought iron gates. The catering staff had completely vanished, abandoning their stations and leaving trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres to spoil in the heavy afternoon heat. The only light remaining on the pool deck came from the massive LED screen, still projecting the undeniable proof of my absolute ownership over their entire lives. I stood there observing the wreckage with cold detachment. But the destruction of my parents was only the first act of this particular tragedy. The real rot in this family ran much deeper, and it was about to expose itself in the most spectacular way possible. A sudden sharp scraping sound drew my attention toward the melting ice sculptures. Jamal slowly stepped out from his hiding place. His flashy velvet blazer, which he had worn with such overwhelming arrogance just an hour ago, now hung on his frame like a cheap costume. The heavy diamond-encrusted watch on his wrist, the very watch I secretly owned, suddenly looked like a pair of handcuffs. He stared up at the towering digital bankruptcy documents, his mouth hanging open in slack-jawed horror. You could practically see the gears grinding inside his incredibly shallow mind as he rapidly connected the dots. Jamal was a man who had built his entire identity on the illusion of his proximity to wealth. He had married Jasmine not because he loved her sharp intellect or her supposed ambition, but because she was the golden ticket to an endless supply of Richard's money. He had tolerated my parents' condescension and played the role of the dutiful son-in-law exclusively for the massive payout he believed was coming his way. He was banking on the inheritance. He was banking on the $17 million estate. Most importantly, he was desperately banking on a massive cash infusion to bail him out of his own suffocating personal debt. He slowly turned his head away from the screen and looked at Jasmine. Jasmine was still standing frozen near the abandoned leather binder, her custom white silk designer dress looking stark and out of place amidst the absolute ruin of her graduation party. Her eyes were red and swollen, her perfect blonde highlights plastered to her sweaty forehead. She looked at Jamal, seeking comfort, seeking the strong, supportive husband she loved to brag about to her high society friends. Jamal, tell them, Jasmine pleaded, her voice trembling with desperate, fragile hope. Tell them this is a mistake. We are going to be fine. My law firm will advance me my salary. We can fix this. Jamal did not walk over to comfort his distressed wife. He did not pull her into his arms or offer a single word of reassurance. Instead, his face twisted into a mask of pure unadulterated revulsion. He looked at her as if she had just handed him a bag of garbage. Your salary. Jamal repeated, his voice a harsh, mocking bark that echoed across the empty patio. Your salary at the law firm. Your daddy just admitted he had to bribe you into. Are you completely out of your mind, Jasmine? He closed the distance between them, but his posture was deeply aggressive. He pointed a shaking finger directly at her face, entirely abandoning the polished gentleman persona he had maintained for the last 2 years. You have absolutely nothing, Jamal shouted, the veins in his neck bulging against his tight collar. Your father is a bankrupt fraud. Your mother is sitting on the ground, crying over a house she does not even own. And you are nothing but a fake lawyer with hundreds of thousands of dollars in student loan debt that your daddy did not actually pay off. Jasmine physically recoiled, taking a step back as if he had just struck her across the face. Jamal? What are you saying? She whispered, her voice breaking. You are my husband. We are a team. We are going to get through this together. A team? Jamal scoffed, letting out a cruel, humorless laugh. We were never a team, Jasmine. We were a business arrangement. And you just went entirely bankrupt. The absolute silence that followed his declaration was deafening. The ugly transactional truth of their marriage, the reality that everyone in the family had always secretly known but politely ignored, was finally dragged out into the harsh daylight. Jamal did not love her. He loved the brand new Lamborghini that was currently waiting to be repossessed. He loved the black credit card that was entirely funded by my private equity firm. He loved the illusion of power. I did not sign up for this, Jamal continued, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. I did not marry into this family to live in a cramped apartment and eat discount groceries while you try to figure out how to be a real lawyer. I married the daughter of a millionaire. I married a trust fund. I did not marry a broke charity case who cannot even afford her own designer shoes. Jasmine let out a sharp, agonizing gasp. The final pillar of her carefully constructed world instantly snapped in half. Her father was a fraud, her mother was a broken mess, her sister was her landlord, and now her husband, the man she had proudly paraded around the country club, was publicly telling her she was absolutely worthless, without a bank account attached to her name. Please, Jasmine begged, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. Please, Jamal, do not do this right now. Do not leave me. I love you. We can start over. She reached out and grabbed the lapels of his velvet blazer, her knuckles turning white as she clung to him like a drowning woman. Jamal looked down at her hands with absolute disgust. He reached up and violently shoved her away. Jasmine stumbled backward, her high heels catching on the edge of a travertine tile. She lost her balance and crashed hard onto the patio floor, scraping her knees and tearing the delicate white silk of her custom dress. She sat there completely stunned, looking up at the man who had just thrown her away like a piece of expired meat. Get your hands off me, Jamal hissed, smoothing his ruined blazer. You are a complete liability. I am not going down with this sinking ship. I have my own image to protect. I have my own career to think about. I watched from the wooden platform, feeling a cold, dark wave of amusement wash over me. His career. He honestly believed he still had a career. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that his supposed executive position at my father's company vanished the second the bankruptcy paperwork was filed. He had absolutely no idea that the massive debt hanging over his penthouse and his diamond watch was currently sitting in a portfolio on my desk in Manhattan. He thought he was escaping the burning building when in reality, he was just running directly into a furnace. "I am calling my attorney first thing tomorrow morning," Jamal announced loudly, looking down at Jasmine as she wept on the stone floor. "I am filing for divorce. I want my name completely separated from this fraudulent family. Do not call my phone. Do not come back to the condo. You can stay here and beg your sister for a room in the basement." He did not even look at Richard or Brenda. He turned on his heel and marched briskly toward the side gate, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the stone. He walked right past Mr. Crawford, keeping his head down, completely terrified of making eye contact with the man who actually held the keys to his destruction. Jamal disappeared through the wrought iron gate, leaving his wife sobbing uncontrollably on the ground. Jasmine broke down entirely. The arrogant golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, was reduced to a hysterical, hyperventilating mess. She pulled her knees to her chest, wrapping her arms around her legs, and rocking back and forth on the hard stone. She wailed a loud, piercing sound of absolute total heartbreak and profound humiliation. Between the wailing of my mother and the hysterical sobbing of my sister, the beautiful $17 million patio sounded exactly like a psychological ward. I stood perfectly still, watching the catastrophic implosion of the family dynamic. They had built a beautiful, towering castle entirely out of lies, greed, and emotional abuse. It only took one single envelope, one undeniable dose of the truth to vaporize the entire structure. The loyalty they claimed to have for one another was completely conditional. The moment the money evaporated, their love instantly turned into vicious survival instinct. I looked down at Jasmine, weeping over the husband who had just exposed his absolute hatred for her. I looked at Richard kneeling in the dirt, completely broken and stripped of his massive ego. I looked at Brenda pulling her own hair and mourning her lost social status. There was no physical violence. There was no screaming match from my end. I simply handed them the mirror, and they completely destroyed themselves. I took a slow, deliberate step down from the wooden platform, my heels echoing heavily in the sudden quiet of the abandoned party. The sprawling travertine patio, which just an hour ago was filled with 200 laughing socialites, was now a massive graveyard of broken crystal glasses and overturned silver trays. The live jazz quartet had fled, leaving behind a single brass trumpet resting on a chair. The entire illusion of my parents' perfect, wealthy life lay shattered across the ground. As my foot touched the stone tile, my mother suddenly scrambled toward me. She crawled across the patio floor, her expensive pink designer suit completely ruined by the spilled champagne and the dirt. She reached out with trembling, manicured hands and clamped her fingers tightly around my wrist. "Nia, please," she sobbed, her face completely streaked with dark mascara and heavy foundation. "Nia, my sweet, beautiful firstborn. You cannot do this to us. You cannot throw your own family out onto the street. We are your blood. I am your mother. Please have mercy on us." I looked down at the hands gripping my arm. It was the exact same grip she had used earlier this afternoon when she dragged me into the catering pantry to hide me from her wealthy guests. But there was no aggressive pinching this time. Her grip was weak, desperate, and completely pathetic. She was looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes, trying to summon a maternal bond that had never actually existed between us. I did not shout at her. I did not kick her away. I simply reached down and deliberately peeled her fingers off my skin one by one. I stepped back, creating a physical boundary between us that mirrored the emotional wall I had built decades ago. "Do not call me your sweet firstborn, Brenda," I said, my voice completely devoid of any warmth or sympathy. Your sweet firstborn died a very long time ago. The woman standing in front of you is simply the landlord collecting on a bad debt. She let out a loud, ragged gasp, pressing her hands to her chest, as if I had physically struck her. But Nia, she wailed, we have nowhere else to go. All of our money is tied up in your father's company. The bank accounts are frozen. If you take this house, we will be homeless. You have so much money now. You own a massive company. You can afford to let us stay. We will be quiet. We will respect you. Just please do not take my home. Your home, I repeated, tilting my head slightly. You mean the home you specifically ordered me not to park my cheap rental car in front of just 3 hours ago? You mean the home where you forced me to walk through the catering entrance because my presence would ruin your aesthetic? You mean the home where you ordered me to take off my own diamond necklace because you assumed I was too poor and too pathetic to own anything of actual value? Brenda flinched at every single word, shrinking back against the stone tile. She opened her mouth to offer an excuse to spin another web of toxic manipulation, but I cut her off instantly. You did not want me mingling near the front of the house, Brenda, I reminded her, my voice dropping into a cold, lethal whisper. You told me to stay in the shadows so I would not humiliate Jasmine on her big day. Well, I am stepping out of the shadows now, and I am telling you that your time in my house has officially expired. I turned my attention away from the weeping woman on the ground and looked toward the long circular driveway. The 4 black tactical SUVs were still idling near the front gates. I raised my right hand and gave a single sharp nod to the massive security operative standing near the lead vehicle. The operative immediately spoke into his wrist microphone. Within seconds, all 4 doors of every single SUV opened simultaneously. A dozen highly trained private security guards dressed in matching black tactical suits stepped out onto the crushed gravel. They moved with terrifying military precision, jogging in a synchronized formation toward the pool deck. They bypassed the repossessed Lamborghini and instantly spread out, forming a solid, impenetrable wall of black uniforms around my parents and my sister. Richard, who was still kneeling near the wooden platform, looked up at the armed guards with absolute hollow defeat. He did not even try to stand up. The booming patriarch, the man who loved to terrorize his employees and bully his eldest daughter, was entirely broken. Jasmine stopped her hysterical wailing, pulling her torn white silk dress tight around her shoulders and staring at the security team in sheer, unadulterated panic. She looked exactly like a frightened child who had just broken an expensive vase and realized nobody was going to save her from the consequences. Mr. Crawford stepped forward, holding a silver pocket watch in his hand. He clicked the heavy metal casing open and looked down at the dial. It is currently 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Mr. Crawford announced, his booming baritone voice echoing off the limestone walls of the mansion. By the authority of the Federal Bankruptcy Court and the sole property owner standing before you, you are officially trespassing on private property. I stepped up next to my attorney, looking directly at the 3 people who had made my entire life a living hell. You have exactly 1 hour, I commanded, projecting my voice so it carried over the soft splashing of the pool water. You have 60 minutes to go up to your massive custom bedrooms and pack exactly 1 suitcase each. You may take your personal clothing and your basic toiletries. You will not touch the expensive imported artwork. You will not take the silver cutlery. You will not attempt to pack any of the luxury jewelry or the designer watches because those items were financed by my company and they are officially seized assets. Jasmine let out a sharp cry of absolute outrage. 1 suitcase, she shrieked, her voice cracking wildly. My designer shoe collection alone fills an entire room. I cannot fit my life into 1 suitcase. You cannot do this to me. I just graduated from Harvard. I am a lawyer. It is completely illegal for you to steal my things. I looked at my sobbing sister, feeling absolutely nothing but a deep, profound sense of closure. I suggest you pack comfortable walking shoes, Jasmine, I advised her coldly. Because the Lamborghini is getting towed and your husband just took the only other car you had access to. You are going to be walking a very long way to find a bus stop. And if you think you can sue me, you are welcome to try representing yourself, since you can no longer afford to hire a real attorney. My father finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, raspy whisper entirely stripped of its former arrogant power. "Nia, please." He begged, his shoulders slumping forward in total, absolute surrender. "I am an old man. I built this family. I gave you life. You cannot just throw us onto the street like stray dogs. Give us a week. Just give us a few days to find a hotel and figure out our finances. We have nothing left." I stared down at the man who had dragged me into his study and threatened to permanently erase me from the family history simply because I would not surrender my only inheritance to fund Jasmine's fake success. He had promised to blacklist me. He had promised to destroy my life. Now he was begging for a hotel room. "When you threatened to throw me out of this house 2 hours ago, Richard," I replied, my voice as hard and unforgiving as a diamond, "you did not offer me a week to pack. You told me you would have your guards drag me out by my hair. Consider this 1 hour deadline an act of profound, extreme generosity." I turned to the lead security operative standing at attention. "Escort them inside," I ordered. "Follow them into every single room. Watch their hands. If they attempt to take anything that belongs to Vanguard Holdings, you are authorized to physically remove it from their possession. At exactly 5 o'clock, you will escort them out of the front gates and you will lock the perimeter." "Yes, Mom," the operative replied sharply. He gestured to his team and the dozen guards immediately moved in, surrounding my parents and my sister, closing the physical circle around them. "Get up!" The operative barked, his voice entirely devoid of the polite deference they were used to receiving from the hired help. "Your hour starts right now. Move." It was the most humiliating, degrading moment of their entire lives. The powerful Richard, the elegant Brenda, and the golden child Jasmine were forcefully pulled to their feet by private security guards. They were marched across the expensive travertine patio like common criminals being escorted to a prison cell. They stumbled and tripped over the broken champagne glasses, leaving a trail of tears and ruined designer clothing behind them. My mother looked back at me one last time before she was pushed through the sliding glass doors into the main house. Her face was a twisted mask of absolute pure hatred and profound, terrifying realization. She finally understood that the dumb one, the invisible ghost sister she had always despised, had completely, entirely won the war. I stood on the patio and watched the glass doors slide shut behind them. The heavy, suffocating weight that had been pressing down on my chest for 35 years completely lifted, evaporating into the hot Georgia air. The toxic atmosphere of the Buckhead estate suddenly felt incredibly crisp and clean. The kingdom of lies had officially fallen, and I was the only one left standing. 6 months have passed since the heavy wrought iron gates of the Buckhead estate closed behind my family for the very last time. The turning of the seasons brought a crisp, cool breeze to Atlanta, sweeping away the suffocating humidity of that unforgettable graduation party. It also swept away the final lingering remnants of my father's fraudulent empire. The federal bankruptcy courts are incredibly thorough machines. Once the initial filings were exposed, there was absolutely no hiding from the avalanche of forensic accountants and federal auditors. Richard was stripped of everything. The man who used to terrorize boardrooms and humiliate me in front of hundreds of people is now 60 years old and working a mid-level desk job at a regional logistics company. He spends his days sitting in a gray fabric cubicle answering phone calls from angry shipping vendors. He drives a 10-year-old used sedan with a rattling transmission and a faded paint job. Every Friday, a massive percentage of his modest paycheck is automatically garnished by the Internal Revenue Service to pay off the staggering fines he accumulated through years of tax evasion and corporate embezzlement. The country club where he used to hold court permanently revoked his membership. The wealthy friends who drank his expensive scotch do not even acknowledge him if they happen to pass him on the street. My mother Brenda lives with him in a small rented duplex on the outskirts of the city. Her life of luxury, her catered parties, and her perfectly manicured social standing have entirely evaporated. I was told by my legal team that she spends most of her time sitting in her tiny living room watching daytime television and waiting for her phone to ring. It never does. The high society women she spent decades desperately trying to impress erased her number the very same afternoon she was escorted off my patio. Jamal discovered very quickly that filing for a hasty divorce does not magically sever your ties to federal crimes. When he arrogantly strutted out of the estate that day, he honestly believed he had successfully escaped the blast radius. He did not realize that my legal team at Vanguard Holdings had already compiled a massive undeniable portfolio of his fraudulent shadow loan applications. We handed that entire portfolio directly over to the federal authorities. Today, Jamal is not wearing velvet blazers or attending exclusive charity galas. He is currently under active federal investigation for multiple counts of wire fraud and criminal credit manipulation. His luxury downtown penthouse was seized by the bank. His diamond-encrusted watches were sold at a public police auction. He is currently living in a cheap motel, desperately trying to find a public defender who will take his case because he can no longer afford private representation. And then there is Jasmine, the golden child, the brilliant legal mind my father had literally bankrupted his own company to create. Without Richard there to write massive donation checks or hire senior paralegals to do her heavy lifting, Jasmine was finally forced to step into the real world and rely entirely on her own abilities. It was an absolute disaster. The prestigious corporate law firm that hired her quickly realized she was completely incompetent. She could not draft basic legal briefs. She routinely missed critical filing deadlines, and she crumbled under the slightest bit of professional pressure. They fired her for gross incompetence exactly 3 months into her employment. Because she had no savings and a mountain of student debt, she could no longer hide from Jasmine was forced to move out of her upscale neighborhood. She is currently living in a cramped, noisy one-bedroom apartment positioned directly next to a major interstate highway. She takes the public bus to interview for entry-level administrative jobs. The designer silk dresses and the custom high heels have been replaced by cheap, practical clothing. The brutal reality of ordinary life finally caught up to the princess who thought she was untouchable. When Mr. Crawford delivered this final status report to my office in Manhattan, I sat at my massive glass desk and looked out over the city skyline. I waited for the rush of vindictive triumph. I waited to feel a petty sense of malicious joy over their absolute ruin. But that feeling never arrived. Instead, I closed the file and felt a deep, profound wave of quiet relief wash over my entire soul. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate their misery. I simply recognized that the heavy, toxic cycle of abuse, manipulation, and conditional love was finally permanently broken. The ghost of the scapegoat daughter, the insecure little girl who just wanted her parents to be proud of her, was finally laid to rest. I did not need to destroy them out of anger. They destroyed themselves because their entire foundation was built on arrogant lies. I was simply the one who handed them the mirror. This morning, I woke up early as the first golden rays of sunlight began to spill across the tops of the Georgia pine trees. I walked out onto the expansive second-floor balcony of the master suite, holding a warm ceramic mug of freshly brewed dark roast coffee. I leaned against the smooth stone railing and took a deep breath of the crisp morning air. The estate looks completely different now. In the 6 months since I took full possession of the property, I ordered a massive, comprehensive renovation. I completely erased the pretentious, suffocating memory of my parents. The cold, intimidating limestone columns and the dark, heavy cherrywood panels were all completely torn out. I replaced them with warm, inviting earth tones, massive floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the natural light and authentic, vibrant artwork created by local minority artists. The house no longer feels like a sterile museum designed to intimidate guests. It finally feels like a home. It breathes with life and genuine warmth. I looked down at the sprawling travertine patio, where the ultimate confrontation had taken place. There were no melting ice sculptures today. There were no fake socialites wearing uncomfortable designer clothing and trading hollow compliments. Instead, the patio was filled with the sound of genuine, booming laughter. I had flown my core executive team down from New York for a weekend corporate retreat. These were the people who had been in the trenches with me for the last 10 years. Down by the pool, my senior financial analyst was playfully arguing about sports statistics with the brilliant woman who runs our international acquisitions department. Sitting at a massive rustic wooden dining table under the shade of the imported palm tree was Mr. Crawford. He was not wearing his terrifying bespoke charcoal suit or carrying a red sealed envelope. He was wearing a comfortable linen shirt, leaning back in his chair and smiling warmly as he shared a story about his grandchildren. Sitting next to him was my very first Wall Street mentor, the woman who had taken a chance on a quiet 25-year-old girl and taught me how to ruthlessly navigate the private equity sector. I stood on the balcony watching them share fresh pastries and pour each other coffee. A profound realization settled into my heart, anchoring me completely to this beautiful new reality. For 35 years, my parents had weaponized the concept of family against me. They used the idea of blood relation as a heavy chain to keep me bound to their abuse. They demanded absolute loyalty while offering absolutely zero respect in return. They believed that simply sharing genetic material gave them the permanent right to diminish my worth and treat me like a stepping stone. But looking down at the brilliant, loyal, fiercely protective people gathered on my patio, I finally understood the absolute truth. Blood does not make you family. Blood is nothing more than a biological accident. True family is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect. It is forged in the fires of unconditional support and unwavering loyalty. The people sitting at that table did not care about my last name. They did not care if I wore a custom silk dress or a cheap navy outfit. They saw my intelligence when my own father called me the dumb one. They celebrated my ambition when my mother told me to hide in the shadows. They stood shoulder to shoulder with me and helped me build an absolute empire from the ground up. They are my chosen family, and the love I have for them is infinitely stronger than any biological tie I ever shared with the people who used to live inside these walls. I took a slow sip of my coffee, the rich, dark flavor warming my chest. I listened to the sound of my friends laughing in the morning sun. The massive $17 million estate was beautiful, but the true wealth I possessed had absolutely nothing to do with the property value or the balance of my corporate accounts. My true wealth was the absolute peace I felt standing on this balcony, knowing I would never have to shrink myself to fit into someone else's narrow expectations ever again. I turned away from the railing, leaving the ghosts of the past completely behind me, and walked back inside to join the people who actually loved me. Stepping back out onto the patio and taking a seat at the head of the table surrounded by my chosen family, I realized something profound. My journey from the invisible ghost sister to the sole owner of the estate was never really about the money. It was never about the luxury cars, the square footage of the mansion, or the balance in my corporate accounts. It was entirely about reclaiming my own narrative from people who had stolen it from me the moment I was born. When you are chosen as the scapegoat in a toxic family dynamic, you are assigned a very specific and incredibly cruel role. You are meant to carry the heavy, suffocating weight of every failure, every insecurity, and every deeply rooted dysfunction that the golden child and the parents refuse to acknowledge. They actively project their darkness onto you so they can pretend to stand in the light. They work tirelessly to convince you that your voice does not matter, that your achievements are completely invisible, and that your only purpose is to serve as a convenient cautionary tale. For 35 years, I accepted that role because I mistakenly believed that enduring their cruelty was the only way to earn a tiny fraction of their love. But true love is not supposed to be a transaction funded by your own dignity. You do not owe your loyalty to people who consistently treat you like an expendable resource. Society aggressively conditions us to believe that family is an unbreakable sacred bond. We are constantly told to forgive, to forget to turn the other cheek, and to keep the peace at all absolute costs. But keeping the peace in a toxic environment usually just means silently absorbing the brutal war they are waging against your mental health. Walking away from people who share your blood is often viewed by the outside world as the ultimate betrayal. People who have never lived in a house full of emotional abuse will call you cold. They will call you ungrateful. They will confidently tell you that you are destroying the family. But you cannot destroy a foundation that was already fundamentally rotten. You cannot break something that was completely shattered long before you decided to stop walking on the glass. Leaving my parents and my sister behind, cutting off their financial supply, and legally evicting them from my property was the hardest and most necessary decision of my entire life. I had to mourn the supportive, loving family I deserved, but never actually received. But in that empty space, in that profound, quiet absence, I finally found the room to build my own authentic identity. I took all the rejection, all the passive-aggressive insults, the times I was forced to use the service entrance, and the moments I was publicly humiliated, and I forged them into an unbreakable armor. I channeled every single ounce of that pain into a relentless drive for absolute independence. I did not need a Harvard degree bought with stolen money. I did not need a massive inheritance. I just needed my own unyielding belief in my own worth. Many people look at what happened on that pool deck and think it was a masterpiece of calculated vengeance. They see the foreclosed mansion, the repossessed luxury cars, the terrified investors, and the public exposure of my father's bankruptcy as the ultimate retaliation. But let me tell you a secret. The financial takedown was simply a natural byproduct of the truth finally coming to light. The real victory happened quietly in the years before that day, when I chose to stop seeking their validation. Because the greatest revenge isn't destroying people who hurt you, it's proving you can build an empire out of the bricks they threw at you. Every insult my father threw at me in his private study was a brick. Every time my mother diminished my accomplishments to her country club friends, it was a brick. Every cruel, venomous whisper from my sister was a brick. For decades, I carried those heavy bricks around, letting them weigh me down and crush my spirit. But then I realized I had a choice. I could put them down. I could stack them up. I could use their absolute negativity to build the foundation of a massive fortress they could never penetrate. And that is exactly what I did. I built a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. I built a life filled with genuine mutual respect. I built a chosen family that loves me unconditionally. I built an empire that completely, entirely eclipsed their fragile kingdom of lies. If you are listening to my voice right now, and you recognize the heavy, suffocating weight of being the family scapegoat, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not crazy. You are not overly sensitive. You are not the problem. The fact that you can clearly see the dysfunction means you are the one with the power to break the generational cycle. You do not have to wait for a dramatic moment at a graduation party to take your life back. You do not need to become a corporate billionaire to prove your immense value to the world. Your worth is already completely inherent. Your true power lies in your ability to establish ironclad boundaries. Your power lies in your absolute refusal to participate in their toxic psychological games for one more second. You have the fundamental right to protect your peace. You have the right to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. And you have the absolute right to completely redefine what the word family means to you. It takes a massive amount of courage to stand up to the people who have known you your entire life and say enough. But the profound, brilliant freedom waiting for you on the other side of that boundary is beautiful beyond description. I know I am not the only one who has had to navigate this incredibly difficult, painful path. Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family only to rise above their expectations? Tell me your story in the comments. Please like, subscribe, and share this with anyone who needs the courage to walk away from toxic family members. We heal by sharing our truths. We grow by realizing we are never isolated in our struggles. Do not let anyone ever convince you that you are destined to be the pathetic supporting character in someone else's grand illusion. Step out of the shadows, claim your space, build your empire. Thank you so much for listening to my journey today. Stay strong, Stay brilliant, and never ever apologize for demanding the respect you absolutely deserve.